Can I welcome everyone to today's meeting of the Transport Committee. In accordance with government regulations, we are holding this meeting virtually, with Assembly members and guests participating remotely. I will call Assembly members to speak by name during the question and answer session, and I will also introduce each guest as they join us. Our main discussion today will be on the progress of the Mayor's transport strategy and challenges for its delivery following COVID-19. Everyone is encouraged to take part in the discussion on social media using the hashtag AssemblyTransport. I will ask the clerk, Lauren Harvey, to confirm the names of Assembly members who are virtually present at this meeting and any apologies for absence.
Thank you, Chair. We have received apologies from Assembly Member Bailey and Assembly Member Curtin. The following members are currently present on this call. Yourself, the Chair, Assembly Member Mull, the Deputy Chair, Assembly Member Pigeon, Assembly Member Devonish, Assembly Member McCartney, Assembly Member Prince, Assembly Member Shah and Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you. Could I ask everyone, as I've just done, to check that their electronic devices are switched to silent to avoid any interruptions, and that during the Q&A session, microphones are set to mute until you are called to speak. Finally, before we start the formal business of this meeting, I'd like to say a few words. This is the last meeting of the Transport Committee before the London elections in May, in what has been an unusual year at the London Assembly. Two members of the committee will be stepping down at the elections. Assembly members Florence Eshimoli, who became an MP in the 2019 general election, and Navin Shah, who leaves the Assembly after many years' service as an Assembly member. Aside from their other roles on the Assembly, they have both chaired the Transport Committee during this term, and I'd like to publicly thank them for their work as part of the committee and as chairs. And I'd like to thank Navin Shah in particular, as my immediate predecessor as chair, for the help and support he gave me in taking up the role last spring.
Thank you, Chair.
Pleasure. Are there any other, so I'd now like to move on to declarations of interest. Are there any other declarations? Can I note the declarations in the report?
Noted.
Thank you. Chair, since the publication of the agenda, minor corrections of a typographical nature have been made to the appendix of the minutes, and they were circulated this morning. Noting those revisions, can we confirm the minutes of the meeting of the Transport Committee held on the 11th of February 2021 to be signed by me as a correct record?
Agreed.
Thank you. On the summary list of actions, can we note the completed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings and additional correspondence sent and received?
Noted.
Can we note the action taken by me as chair under delegated authority and as set out in the report, namely to agree the committee's report entitled Crossrail, Light at the End of the Tunnel, and the accompanying guide Crossrail, the project at a glance, and to agree a variation of the standard terms of appointment for a London Travel Watch board member?
Agreed.
Thank you. Before we begin, may I first draw members' attention to the additional correspondence circulated via a memo pack on Friday, which is of relevance to this discussion. Can I also welcome our guests joining us for today's meeting? Heidi Alexander, Deputy Mayor for Transport, Andy Byford, Commissioner of Transport for London, and Dr Will Norman, Walking and Cycling Commissioner, GLA. Would you each like to say a few words by way of introduction to our questions and answers today? And I understand Heidi will go first. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison, and good to see you all today, and thank you for the opportunity to say a few words. Can I actually start by saying thank you to you, Chair, and to other members of the committee for the very collaborative way in which we have worked over the last year. I'd also like to thank everyone at TfL for their dedication and professionalism over what has been a very difficult period. The fact that 87 men and women from TfL and our partner organisations have now lost their lives due to COVID is tragic, and my thoughts remain with their family and friends. It's been a hard year. Londoners' lives have been turned upside down, and of course the amount of travel we currently do is a mere fraction of what it once was. The weekday tidal wave of millions of Londoners making their way to tubes, trains and buses every morning has, of course, dried up, replaced with a small stream of critical workers who have kept our city running. Our trips to see friends and family, to go shopping, to go to pubs and restaurants have also evaporated, replaced with online interactions and purchases. Trade for black taxis and minicabs has all but disappeared. Our roads have been less busy overall, but delivery drivers seem to have been more in demand than ever. It's a well-known fact that since last April, tube travel fell to 5% of pre-COVID levels, and it has barely got above 40% at any time since then. Journeys on the bus network have remained slightly more buoyant, but the half-empty double-deckers on our roads have been a sad sight. Fare income has plummeted, nearly £3 billion down over the last year, a drop of 70%. And for an organisation that normally spends around £10 billion a year, this has created huge turbulence and great uncertainty. Government has, of course, stepped in and provided TfL with support for which I'm very grateful. I am disappointed, though, about how needlessly political the funding negotiations have been. It's clear that emergency revenue support is going to continue to be required over the next couple of years, with capital support essential beyond that if the government is to meet its own recovery objectives and zero carbon ambitions. Despite the imminent election, I hope ministers can put the politics to one side and just do what is right for London. Whilst we now have some idea of when lockdown restrictions are going to be lifted, the question of how quickly confidence returns is something that no one can answer. None of us really know how quickly life will spring back, what happens with new COVID variants, or to what extent some of the changes we have embedded in our day-to-day existence will remain. We don't know whether London's home working revolution is here to stay, and even if it is, what that means for other journeys people may do throughout the course of the week for other purposes. What we do know, though, is that cities are resilient. We know that if you look at London's population over the last century, it has gone through periods of growth and periods of retrenchment. We know that London will be critical to the UK's recovery and that public transport is critical to London. We need to continue to run maximum services to build confidence. If Londoners think they're going to be squeezed under someone's armpit on less frequent tubes, they won't come back to their offices, they won't come back to central London's shops, theatres and restaurants, and London won't get back to providing its £38 billion net contribution to the Treasury that funds public services across the country. Wholesale cuts to services now would be a completely false economy, as would significant cuts to TfL's capital programme. And I should be clear on one thing. No matter what comes out of the next round of financial negotiations with government, neither the Commissioner nor I would ever countenance cuts that compromise safety. It really is simple. Unsafe services or assets won't stay open, they will shut. It's remarkable that I find myself having to say this, but a good public transport system, which lies at the heart of the Mayor's transport strategy, is a reliable and a safe one where adequate funds are spent on maintenance and renewals and corners aren't cut. I will continue to do all that I can to ensure that this is understood by government and to make sure TfL is well placed to facilitate the rapid, fair and green recovery that both London and the country needs. It's my view that the Mayor's transport strategy remains the foundation on which such a recovery can be built, and I look forward to discussing that with you all today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heidi. Very expansive words about what has been a very difficult year. Can we move on to Andy Byford, please?
Sure, thank you. Good afternoon, Chair. Good afternoon, Assembly members. And I'd like to pick up really where Heidi left off, and I start from the perspective as someone who took up this wonderful, fantastic role of Transport Commissioner at a really quite surreal time. I mean, I've been in the job now just short of 9 months. I said on the first day there were two primary objectives, and they remain the two primary objectives. Number one, to lead TfL through and beyond the COVID crisis, to rebuild our ridership ridership, to rebuild the finances, to rebuild the morale of the organisation, and we're addressing all three of those aims, and also in parallel to push on and get the Elizabeth line open, finish off the Crossrail project and get the Elizabeth line open. So there's no exaggeration to say that those two primary equal priority objectives have dominated my time to date. And that's because, you know, it is no secret, as the Deputy Mayor was just saying, the pandemic has hit TfL as hard as anywhere. I mean, it is literally heartbreaking that 87 now of our colleagues have died with COVID in the last, basically the last year. I mean, it's just taken a terrible toll on the organisation. And it's to the absolute credit of TfL staff that we've kept going. A bit like was said of London Transport in the Blitz, we kept going. And I'm very proud of the men and women of TfL for doing that, a very professional organisation. And again, I have the perspective and the benefit of having worked elsewhere. This really is a quality organisation. It really is populated by very dedicated, very passionate, very professional people, and I'm honoured to be their commissioner. So, I mean, really, it takes us to the subject in discussion today, the Mayor's transport strategy. So we're crystal clear on our responsibilities. The Mayor obviously sets that agenda, sets that strategy, and it's our job as the Transport Authority, the Integrated Transport Authority, to deliver on that strategy. So that's what we set out to do. The transport strategy, in addition to what the day job, if you like, of running tubes, buses, and all the other modes, it really does set the overall strategic objectives for the organisation and directs everything that we do, because rightly, as an integrated authority and as I would say a very forward-thinking authority, we're not just talking about moving people from A to B. We have a wider objective, namely contributing to city or to London's social objectives in terms of the partnerships we have with house builders to provide more affordable homes, building on TfL's land, not just selling it in some fire sale, but actually using it in a more enlightened manner to create ridership for the future and to create revenue on an ongoing basis, but also very much focused on getting people out of their cars, getting towards that 80% dream that the Mayor sets out by 2041, having 80% of journeys on public transport, cycling or walking, and thereby materially contributing to the benefits of living in London and the lifestyle of Londoners, ultimately breathing fresh air. So we're very committed to that. That hasn't changed as a result of COVID. But clearly, as the Deputy Mayor said, there will be changes, I think, as a result of COVID. We've modelled various scenarios going forward. We know that there won't be an immediate mass return to the days of old in terms of people riding, cheek to jowl on the Central or the Northern line. That is, I think those days probably are gone. But having said that, we have modelled what we think is a realistic expectation. And we have also modelled a path back to financial self-sustainability for our day-to-day operating costs by 23-24. In the interim, we will, as the Deputy Mayor said, we will need some ongoing revenue support until we reach that position. We will then need devolved powers in order to plug the gap of the ridership that won't then ensue, and we need to wean ourselves off a dangerous over-reliance, 72% reliance on fares through the fare box. We've got to diversify that operating revenue. And then on capital, as again the Deputy Mayor alluded to, we are in negotiations with government, tough negotiations, but we've made a very positive case, a case that is predicated around the government's own messages. They want an infrastructure-led recovery with shovel-ready projects that create wealth and jobs. We can provide those. They want a green recovery. Well, let's get on with electrifying our bus fleet. Let's push on with that and thereby drive that whole agenda for the whole of the country. If our buses get electrified, that creates a viable production line for other cities around the country. And thirdly, government wants a levelled up agenda. Well, you don't get levelling up by levelling down London. You've got to feed the golden goose, £39 billion net contributed by London. And in any case, don't forget, we spend 55p of every pound out in the region. So a healthy transport system will get London back on its feet, and London on its feet drives the UK recovery. So I remain committed to the MTS. I believe that it's absolutely the right path for the future. It has been challenging. We'll discuss today where we've struggled, but we've, I think, got lots to say, lots of positive successes in the MTS, and I believe very much that we can continue to deliver in that regard. So I'll just close again on paying tribute to those of our colleagues who are no longer with us. It's they will never be forgotten by TfL, and it's their legacy that makes me more determined than ever to pull out of this COVID crisis and take London's transport system into a much more positive place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you for ending on your remarks on that sobering note. Finally, Will, if you'd like to say a few words.
Thanks, Alison, and thanks everybody else. Just to echo Heidi and Andy, this has been an incredibly tough year for London and for Londoners, and I would also like to pay tribute to those colleagues that we've lost. I think in this very, very dark cloud that is COVID, the increase in people walking and cycling that we've seen is one of the very few silver linings. I sort of look back over the last year, and you think of the first lockdown where we were all stuck at home, the offices, pubs, restaurants all closed. And one of the things that we saw was a significant reduction in traffic. These are there in the data. We all saw that and experienced it. But suddenly our streets were quieter and people started using them in different ways. People were cycling around their local neighborhoods. They were walking to their parks. I know outside my house, there were kids skateboarding and scooting and using all sorts of funny devices I'd never seen before. But it showed what could be different. And as that lockdown lifted, we saw we knew that the social distancing measures that were put in meant that there was a massive reduction in capacity on public transport. And my fear at that time was actually if a fraction of those journeys that had been being used by public transport shifted to cars, then we'd end up with gridlock on the roads, which is terrible for the economy, but we'd also end up with an air pollution crisis, which is the very last thing anyone needs in the middle of a respiratory disease pandemic. So I think, with TfL, we very rapidly rolled out that program of temporary measures to enable more people to be able to carry on doing what they were doing and safely walk, safely cycle, and not to use the car when they couldn't, both freeing up space on the road and the tube and the buses for those people who maybe couldn't walk or cycle. I think what London did, reflecting back on the year, was absolutely remarkable. No other city has done as much as London has done in less than 12 months. And what was equally remarkable is the change that brought about. The numbers and the number of people changing the way they're travelling around is incredible. And I know that we'll sort of explore that maybe a bit more in the session. But I want to just say, just like Andy did and Heidi did, express my thanks to the incredible colleagues at TfL, but not just TfL, but all the teams across all the boroughs, the transport teams in every London borough stepped up and delivered stuff that it was, just would be hard at the best of times, but to do it in the difficult circumstances of working from home, caring for loved ones, the stress and emotional challenge of a pandemic, whether it's the designers, the engineers, the teams that were actually on the roads delivering things, the police that were enforcing, they all have done an absolutely astonishing job in exceptionally difficult circumstances to keep our city moving. So I really want to finish with a big thank you to them because they've been world class.
Thank you very much, Will, and that's an upbeat note on which to end your introduction. So thank you, and I may say I've actually made tentative steps back into cycling for the first time in too many years, actually. And I am determined to do that. I was saying to Heidi the other day, I am determined to be cycling to counter surgery once we resume those, because actually that's a perfectly sensible routine journey that I ought to be doing on a bike. So I'll give you a progress report on that one. Anyway, in time-honoured fashion, if we can move on to the questions we have for the three of you today. As you know, we will, different Assembly members will ask different blocks of questions, we will all try to keep our questions succinct, and I hope you'll be able to do that with your answers, because as always with the Transport Committee, everybody is always wanting to ask a bit more, and we would like to finish before the evening, but I will sometimes chivvy and keep to time, so don't take it personally. It's just trying to make sure that we get the best out of you as guests today and use your time as best we can. So if I could start with a section on background and the impact of COVID-19 on the Mayor's transport strategy. And my first question is for Heidi. How has COVID-19 impacted the delivery of the Mayor's transport strategy, particularly in terms of the overall target for mode share?
Thanks, Alison. Well, I think committee members are probably aware that there has been a short-term negative impact upon our sustainable mode share over the last year. That's to say, there is a smaller proportion of journeys that are being done by people using public transport, walking or cycling. But that is in the context of less travel happening overall. I think if we cast our mind back to when we had this session last year, I actually checked this weekend about what I said when I came to the Transport Committee in March of last year. And I think it was around the 12th of March, I said we were seeing a small impact upon public transport usage at that time. But frankly, within days of that meeting, what was a small reduction on the tube turned into a mass exodus. And you'll recall, we within a week of that meeting, we had put a press release out that announced that we were closing 40 tube stations, that the Waterloo and City line, that the night tube was closing. Of course, those haven't reopened yet. And so there has been a really dramatic change, I think, in both the amount of travel that people have been doing overall, but also the way that they've been travelling. I think when you compare the way that people have used public transport to the way that they've been using their cars, those households in London that do have access to a car, and we should always remember when we talk about this, that it is only about half of households that have access to a car in London. Car usage has remained a lot more buoyant than public transport usage, and there's been a differential impact in different parts of London when you look at how many vehicles we're seeing in central London, inner and outer London. Will mentioned this when he made his introductory remarks, though. We have actually seen a higher proportion of journeys being done by people who are walking and cycling. So that's a good thing, but it has been a year of the world sort of turning upside down, really, I guess, in terms of how people travel in London. Having said that, I do think that, when you think about the three main areas of the Mayor's transport strategy, healthy streets for healthy people, making sure that everyone has a good public transport experience, and ensuring that investment in public transport delivers new homes and jobs. I think those three objectives are still really, really relevant. When you think about the healthy streets agenda, we know that there is a relationship between levels of obesity and the worst impacts of COVID. We know that there's emerging evidence linking the worst impacts of COVID with poor air quality. And so I think getting more people walking and cycling and continuing our drive to clean up London's air is really, really important. I think that, that good public transport experience is going to be critical going forward. We can't usher in a new era of gridlock in London. We've got to make sure that our tubes, our buses, our trains, our trams are actually the option of choice for people, that people actually want to use those modes to get around London. And I also think that, whilst there may be questions, and we might come to this in the session about is it as critical as it once was to be building new homes and ensuring that the public transport is there to facilitate new areas of development. I do think it's critical. I think that we had a housing crisis before we went into the pandemic, and we know that during the pandemic, in some of the poorest parts of London, where we've seen very high levels of overcrowding in social housing, in private rented housing, that COVID really ripped through those communities. And so I think that the moral imperative to be building affordable homes and to be making sure that the public transport network is there to assist in building affordable housing. I think that's really more important than ever. And so I think the Mayor's transport strategy is still very, very relevant. Clearly the impact upon TfL's finances, given changing travel patterns, is something that we're having to grapple with in the short term, and there is, likely to be consequences over the medium term as well, because, all of those things that I've talked about, investing in public transport, making it safer and more appealing for people to walk and cycle, that all, of course, costs money. And so I do think that what comes out of the next round of negotiations that we're having with government is going to be critical in terms of how we can continue to deliver progress in meeting the objectives of the MTS.
Thank you very much, Heidi. That's a series of very good points. And yes, of course, we will come to those other elements of the MTS as we progress through our discussion. But thank you for that. Now, I'd like to move on to Andy Byford, and ask, I mean, Heidi has started to unpick, as has Will, some of this, but how has the pandemic affected mode shares in the short term? And how does this impact on the Mayor's transport strategy for 80% of trips to be made by active, efficient and sustainable modes by 2041?
Sure. Okay. So, Chair, before the pandemic, we were at 63%, and we're now at 55%. So there's less active travel overall. And at the end of the day, it's been a bit of a moving feast, because having plunged, as the Deputy Mayor, said, to around 5%, actually 5% on the tube when the first lockdown hit, and everyone listened to the government's advice, rightly so, and we kept the capacity for key workers. The tube plunged to levels of ridership not seen since Victorian times. It's been that dramatic, actually. It then began to recover when we had the interregnum between the lockdowns. We got the buses up to around 55%, the tube went up to about 30%. By percentages, I mean of normal ridership. Right now, the tube's about 20% of normal ridership, and the buses are around 30% of normal ridership. And sometimes comparing like for like is difficult, because each lockdown has had slightly different variables in terms of what you can or cannot do, and what's open and what isn't open. But what we are saying is we don't expect that we will get back to those back to those 2019 levels until well into 2021. So later this year, we might begin to get back to that sort of 63% that I was talking about. What we can say is, in terms of indicative estimates of the impact on the pandemic so far, the first 3 quarters of 2020, in the second quarter of 2020, I'm looking at some stats here, the public transport mode share was down to just 8.2%, and the overall active, efficient and sustainable mode share went down by 8.5 percentage points. So as I've said, in quarter 3, when lockdown measures were relaxed, we did pick up a little bit, but we've since slipped back. So do I think that's a long-term impact? I mean, I certainly think, as I said in my opener, that we won't get back to the really crowded situation that we saw before, not certainly in the medium term, maybe in the long term. But is the strategy still the correct one? Absolutely. Is the vision and the ambition to get to that 80% of journeys conducted by public transport on foot or by cycle? Absolutely. So that's one thing that hasn't changed as a result of COVID.
Thank you very much, Andy. And I would say, as somebody came down into central London on the tube, down the Northern Line today, mask wearing pretty much entirely, virtually everybody I saw was wearing masks, and the system is very well organised, but it is quieter, obviously, but it's clearly there waiting for us to start to repopulate it as the city starts to open up. Can I move on to Will? What do the changes in trends for cycling and walking in inner and outer London during the pandemic pose in terms of opportunities and challenges for the Mayor's sustainable transport targets?
Yeah, thanks, Alison. As I said, there have been a lot of changes. So, within, I think, 22,000 metres of extra pavement space, at least 90 to 100 kilometres of new and upgraded cycle lanes, 100 and something low traffic neighbourhoods, I think 300 school streets. I could spout these figures, but essentially there's been a lot of change over a very short period of time. And although Heidi and Andy both said that the overall numbers of journeys are down this year because people are not going out, we're not being told to stay at home. People are obviously exercising and they're doing those essential journeys. And in terms of the walking and cycling piece, obviously central London, which historically has had a lot of people cycling because people are coming into the offices, much less. But across the board, we've seen some really quite significant changes. So cycling in outer London was up 22% across the week, and 7% up in inner London. But at weekends, we've seen this enormous surge. Last 2 weekends consecutively, I think we've seen over 200% increase in people cycling. In some parts of London, that's been 300, even 400% up. So we're seeing this significant change. Walking is been much harder to count, actually, because of the measures that we use and people not being on the street to do. But we've seen that, I think we saw the information that Andy and the team published in December showed that 31% of Londoners were saying that they were walking journeys that they had previously driven. And we're seeing 57% of Londoners saying that they want to walk further or so they are walking further and more, which is great. So we're seeing this change. I think what's really positive for me in terms of the future trends is that a lot of these people who are cycling are new to cycling. You know, I've been speaking to bike shops who've been a great source of information, and they're talking about bikes coming out of hibernation. You know, the things that have been rusting in the shed. They've been having to get new chains and new inner tubes and all this sort of stuff, or coming off, dusting off balconies, you know, being used more, all by people. The bike shops are running out of bikes, and so people are buying bikes who haven't done in the past. You know, but you know, your story is by no means unique in terms of this, which I think is very positive. But we think, you know, in terms of we need to capture and build on that enthusiasm, continuing to build the safe infrastructure. There's some really significant opportunities here. Heidi touched on the health benefits. The physical health benefits of being active are increasingly becoming more evident, whether it's the damage and the impact of chronic disease. You can see that associated with COVID, but this is not new. Diabetes and these problems are really significant challenges to the health service and our city's resilience moving forward. But we also have a mental health crisis. And I think the sort of walking and cycling there's plenty of evidence that stacks up that it helps mental health. But walkable neighborhoods tackle social isolation. There's evidence, one of the studies I've just been reading showed that 80% increase in social capital where you live in a walkable neighborhood. That means, in layman's terms, you basically bump into your neighbors, you see people, you talk to people. And if we're coming out of that isolation, I think that's really important. It's also really good for the economy. And we know how hard high streets, you know, have been hit and retail has been hit. You know, all the evidence shows that if people are walking and cycling in those neighborhoods, then they spend more, up to 40% more footfall in shops, greater retail spend. So there's a huge opportunity here, not just in terms of transport, but all the outcomes that we want to see for that successful city. There are challenges, you know, there's no doubt there are challenges, you know, not least because we're running out of bikes. You know, the bike shops are running out and meeting supply is a real problem. I asked someone to go and speak to, been speaking to industry quite a bit. I got someone to speak to the production factories in Japan and Taiwan this week because they need to up production globally to meet the demand, and London is leading the search on that. Bike parking's a real challenge. You know, you can have bike groups, but stopping and you've got to lock up somewhere where you stop or start and stop. So we've just invested another £1 million in more bike parking. One of the challenges has been actually doing how we count, because often we depend on people being out on the streets doing counts. So it's really impressive seeing new technologies and new methods being thought up on how we can do that more sort of electronically. But most importantly, we need to build that network of safe cycle routes, better crossings for pedestrians, and I think that remains the biggest challenge. You know, it's controversial. We know there's backlash. Getting it right, making sure that this is all accessible for everybody and not just a few. How do we engage everybody, not just listening to those people who shout loudest? There's a list. The challenges are still there, but as both Heidi and Andy said, given the opportunities and the benefits for our city, the Mayor's transport strategy is exactly right, and COVID has just shown how important it is that we have been doing this up until now. Every other city in the country has been facing the same challenges as us, but London's the only one that has really stepped up and delivered anything like this scale and pace, and that's down to the fact we've been doing it already, and we've got the expert and we've got the teams on the ground who are experienced and are good at this.
Thank you very much, Will. Yes, it's very much about balancing the needs of road users and road and pavement users. But I'd hear you about in two ways, I think, particularly. One is about getting people to make more positive choices about the journeys that they do make, and actually choosing to walk to the supermarket when they might have jumped in the car. And I think I hope that's one of the legacies we may have. And the other is very much around that social aspect and the people you bump into as you walk. And that's certainly something that I've noticed in the depths of lockdown. Actually, that was one of those things that kept you going during that period. So thank you all very much for that, those introductory questions. I'd like to move on to Assemblymember Joanne McCartney, who's going to ask the second block of questions.
Thank you. And Will, if you can send someone to sort out my gears on my rusty bike, that would be... But my question is that Alison has talked about how COVID has affected modal share. So my first question is to Deputy Mayor, and it's a bit more generalised question, and that's how have events over the last year affected the objectives, targets and the delivery plan of the Mayor's transport strategy?
Thanks, Joanne. I think I perhaps sort of touched on some of that in the answer to the first question, talking about how I think the three main building blocks of the Mayor's transport strategy, healthy streets, public transport, and assisting with the development of homes in the right places. I think that they are still really relevant, and I won't repeat what I set out about my reasons for thinking that. I do think that it is important to, in this time of great turbulence and turmoil, to actually just take a step back and, remind ourselves that many of the challenges, if not all of the challenges that the city was facing before the pandemic, are still going to be there after the pandemic, and some of them have been exacerbated. And so, we do still have a situation where there's a finite amount of space on London's roads. We know that we still need to tackle London's toxic air, that we need to tackle carbon emissions, that we need to, tackle the levels of road danger that exist. That we need to make the public transport system more accessible for everyone. And so I think that whilst this year has perhaps made it more difficult to meet that 80% mode share target, I think some people will be thinking, actually, do I want to go back to public transport? And I think TfL has a responsibility, when the time is right, to be saying to people, look, this is safe. We've enhanced our cleaning regime. We're enforcing face coverings. We're running maximum services to enable social distancing. But that, I think there will be a nervousness amongst the public who have been living their lives in a very different way. And so we've got to make sure that we get the people who used to be using public transport back onto public transport, not turning to their cars to do trips. I think there may be a sense amongst the public that perhaps you've got safe private space in your car, and so I think we're going to have to be very alive to these concerns and do everything we can to reassure people and get people back, as I say, when the time is right. I do think though that it is a period of people resetting how they live, and we know that people do change their behaviour when big things happen in their lives. If you get a new job or you move house, that's the moment in time when you're more likely to change the way you travel. And so as we come out of the pandemic, there may be changes in the way that people are working. Some people might be going into the office less. Some people might not go in for as many hours in the day, and they might try and avoid what used to be that old rush hour crush in the mornings. We might see that people use trains to get into mainline train stations in the city, but then don't choose to jump on the tube or the bus to get to their final destination. And some of these things might be good in terms of people's own health, walking for, I think it's 20 minutes a day, we're meant to be walking, doing some form of exercise. That's good, and that's an outcome we would want to support and enable. Might have some implications in terms of TfL's finances, and so we have to work through all of that. But those are the sorts of discussions I think that, I'm having really on a daily basis with the team at TfL about, what can we do to, support more walking and cycling. Also about the sort of relative balance of what we're trying to achieve within the Mayor's Transport Strategy, because it's an all-encompassing document, but you might need to dial certain things up and dial certain things down as a result of the pandemic. So, historically, we've been very focused on increasing capacity on existing, tube and rail routes into London. And there's a question about, well, is that going to be the most important focus going forward if people are working a bit more from home? Do we need to think about how we can invest more in making those short trips into local town centres safer and more attractive for people to do on foot and by bike? Do we need to think about is connectivity and opening up new areas of development and new homes going to be more important than putting that capacity on existing routes? Do we need to do more with things like freight consolidation? If we're all online and we've got more deliveries coming to our doors as opposed to us going out to, pick up goods, then, perhaps we need to make sure that we're doing more around freight consolidation. And so those are the sorts of discussions that we are having at the moment. And I think the MTS gives us quite a good framework through which we can answer some of these questions, because if I'm honest, I do think the jury is still out a little bit. We don't really know. And over the next 6 months, we've seen really good progress with the vaccinations. But I think the next 6 months are going to be critical in terms of working out how people start to live their lives in a different way, post what is hopefully going to be the worst of the pandemic when that's behind us.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that leads me on very nicely to my next question for the Commissioner, if I can. And that's, Heidi's talked about dialing things up and dialing things down. And just from a management point of view, could you just outline how or whether the pandemic has actually changed the way TfL prioritise its work? And do you see that change into the future too?
Sure. Well, I mean, there have been some upsides to it, believe it or not, because what it has forced us to do is become very, 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 very efficient and more effective than ever in our decision making. Yeah, we've had to adjust. Same as everyone else, we've had to get a lot of our work done remotely, but we've also had to be much more dynamic in our decision making, because it's been a very fast moving agenda, and obviously having to also think through very quickly what are the implications of the various tiers or lockdown scenarios that we faced. Only this morning we had to make sure we got the return to schools right. It's the second time we've done it. But rapidly getting hold of additional buses, creating the school specials. As Heidi mentioned, we've put a huge amount of short-term focus, but really concerted focus into making the system cleaner than ever, industrial levels of cleaning. We've had academia in to do random testing of touch points and of air quality, and to test for any trace of COVID. They can't find any. So far, we've had, I think, 4 rounds, and they've not been able to find a trace, which is testament to our cleaners. We've had to move very quickly in terms of how we deploy our resources, given that we don't operate in isolation. We've also had to put people on furlough, not anymore, but we've lost people. We've had people who are CEV, clinically extremely vulnerable. So we've really fought an absolute battle to keep the service going. We've redeployed people to do enhanced checks of enforcement to make sure that people are wearing masks. So a lot of what we've been doing has been kind of short term, because we've had to move in against a very fast-moving agenda, but also the key thing was to keep the system clean, to keep the systems controlled so that people had confidence that it was a controlled environment, and to maintain social distancing by, against the odds, keeping the service moving. Having said that, there are clouds on the horizon, because the the financial situation is pretty scary. We are in the second of our bailouts at the moment, our funding deals. That expires on the 31st of March. We are pushing very hard to get as long a term a deal as we can. It may not come straight away, but we certainly, what I want to achieve is a long-term deal that would be good for government, good for London, good for the country. To not get that kind of financial support, that really would then change our approach. But right now, it's still very much, Assembly Member, focused on delivering the MTS, albeit in the short term, we've had to take some of the steps that I just described.
Thank you. And then on from that, could you just outline to us in brief terms what major transport projects under the MTS have either had to be delayed or cancelled as a result of the pandemic, and how does that affect the timescale for delivery?
Sure. So the easiest way to say it is obviously, and Heidi mentioned this in her opener, job one is always, in any transport system, and all the ones I've ever worked in, job one, absolutely, if you've got finite funds or if your budget is cut, the one thing you must do is keep the existing system in a safe and secure state. It's got to be maintained in a state of good repair, because that is a legal responsibility. It's also a moral imperative. We've got to look after our customers and our colleagues to make sure that they're operating a safe system. So that's number one. But above anything else, keep the system safe. I'd say the second priority is to finish off what's already started. You know, it'd be crazy to start something new if you didn't have enough funding. Let's get the Crossrail project finished. Let's get the Elizabeth line open. The Northern Line extension is going to open later this year down to Battersea Power Station. It looks amazing. We're running test trains at the moment. We've got the Barking Riverside extension making good progress. We've got the work at Bank to put in the additional platform coming along nicely. We just announced the design for the Piccadilly line trains. That, 1973, those trains, the old trains, were introduced. It's time to replace them. So those are our real priorities. But we're not tone deaf. We do know that there is a financial crisis for the country, £2 trillion debt now, so we won't be able to do everything. So the two headline projects that are on hold are Crossrail 2 and the Bakerloo line extension, both of which we think have good business cases. We're not saying that we don't want to do them, but for now, the route was just announced for the Bakerloo line extension. The Secretary of State has safeguarded the route. We're seeking safeguarding at some point for Crossrail 2. They're still on the ledger. We still want to do them. The work isn't wasted. The teams have done a great job, but for now, Assembly Member, those two are on hold.
Thank you. And I hope that the case for the Piccadilly line track and signalling is also being made to government. I remember when the predecessor was last in front of us, he said that was obviously one of the, I think he said it was the number one priority of new investment that TfL was after. And I know that this committee would support you in those efforts.
Well, just on that point, if I may, what was unveiled the other day was the design for the new Piccadilly line trains. And I think they look absolutely fantastic. They'll be air conditioned, they're open gangway. In other words, you can walk all the way through. You don't have individual carriages. They've got diagnostics on them so that the train effectively tells the maintenance staff if something is beginning to go wrong, so you get higher reliability. A set of doors that may be beginning to run a bit slowly, it will send an alarm to the maintenance people. It will get looked at overnight. So these are real state-of-the-art trains. But to your point, to me, it would be madness to buy those new trains and to not do the work to the depots to accommodate them, to the track to make sure that they can run smoothly and don't get shaken to bits. But particularly, I feel very strongly about this, it would be crazy not to upgrade the signalling to modern CBTC, communications-based train control, where you can safely run more trains closer together. In other words, you can get more line capacity. So in our capital submissions, we're fighting a real battle to keep that in the portfolio.
Thank you for that, and that's reassuring to know. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those answers. And we'd now like to move on to our second and larger section, which is about the delivery of the Mayor's Transport Strategy key themes since COVID-19. And Assembly Member Caroline Pidgeon is going to lead off with the... No, sorry, I apologise. Councillor Russell... Caroline Russell, is going to lead off with the first half of this first question. So over to you. Sorry, Caroline. I've misread my notes as I moved pages.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, no, there's far too many people called Caroline on the
No,
assembly.
only just enough. Just enough.
Anyway, yes, so my first question is for Heidi, and it's looking at what have been the key impacts of COVID-19 on the delivery of the MTS Healthy Streets and Healthy People objectives, both in the short and in the longer term.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. And perhaps on International Women's Day, perhaps I could start by saying it's a nice problem to have two Carolines on the Transport Committee. So the question is about the impact of COVID on the Healthy Streets portfolio of work. I actually think this is an area where you could argue that we have done more than we would have done had the pandemic not hit. And so I do think we've got a really, really good story to tell on all of this, and Will's leadership and incredible hard work. I know how hard he's been working over the last year. We should record that and thank Will for those efforts, because it has been really impressive. And I think the boroughs as well have been really, really flexible and responsive. So I think we have proven that we can do more for less. Even before we went into the pandemic, we had tripled the amount of protected cycleways. I think Will mentioned in his remarks earlier that since then we've upgraded about 90 kilometres or put new cycleways in, which amount to 90 kilometres in length. We've introduced school streets across boroughs. There are low traffic neighbourhoods. I've lost count of the number of times that Will has said to me that we have broken records with the Santander cycle hire scheme. And I know that there was one weekend in central London where TfL analysts actually thought that there must have been a malfunction in the counter software because it was recording so many people at the weekend cycling. And so, whether it's in central London at the weekends or the higher levels of cycling that we've seen out in inner and outer London, I think is really about us making sure that we're enabling more people to cycle safely. I'm also really pleased that we've been able to launch the trial of the 24/7 bus lanes. I think bus reliability and bus speeds are an integral part of our Healthy Streets work, and so to have got that launched, I think is really good, and we'll be reviewing how all of that has gone. So whilst there's been less money available overall, the support that we have got from government to enable us to still continue to invest in improving the environment for people walking and cycling, and also the work that we've been doing with the bus network, I think has been a really positive thing to have come out of this pandemic.
Mm-hmm. I suppose what I was reaching towards is, yes, it has been extraordinary what has come out of this last year, and hats off to Will and all the people working in the boroughs and at TfL on delivering so many changes to make a safer network for people to walk and to cycle. But there are some places that are so hostile that actually the sort of pop-up bike lane or the kind of, sort of smaller street space interventions just don't quite do it. Those are those big hostile junctions, some of them in outer London. Keith and I visited Gallows Corner when we did the hostile streets report for this committee. And so I suppose, are you concerned about your ability to tackle some of those bigger, more difficult places where making it safe for people to walk and cycle is actually really challenging because it's such a sort of car-dominated environment? I can see Will kind of wanting to come in. Did you want to come in on this one?
I'll let Hayden go first, but I'm happy to come in on this because I know exactly what you mean, and this is a challenge.
I'm quite happy Will to take this one because I think he probably is closer to the detail.
So Caroline, you're right. There's only so much you can do with emergency measures, temporary schemes, temporary materials. You know, I look at those wands. I think someone called them magic wands the other day. You know, you can deliver an awful lot of light segregated protective cycle lanes very quickly in terms of the links. You know, the spaces between the junctions, but to actually tackle some of those big hostile junctions, you know, outer London, you mentioned Gallows Corner. I could mention Mile End Junction with Burdett Road. It's a very big, difficult road. You can't do those junctions in temporary materials and temporary measures. They require new curbs. They require new types of crossings to make the pedestrian crossing. So that needs new signals and new signal infrastructure. To do that, you need better drainage, and you need to move the drainage around. So while the healthy streets sort of ethos, and I think we delivered a huge amount in this, you can't do it all in temporary measures, you know, and to be honest, when the emergency hit, we paused all the permanent programs for healthy streets, largely also because we were restricted on the COVID, people in construction, so everything went to a safe stop. Coming out of this, I think there is the need to, you know, and we are now restarting some of the permanent schemes. So, for example, Cycleway 4 that runs from Tower Bridge down towards Greenwich. There's a section there that you could do it in temporary materials, but it would have such a detrimental impact on the bus network that actually the benefits of the scheme would be massively reduced. So that's a scheme that has to be done. And areas of that has to be done in permanent materials to make the scheme work. And so for me, you know, there has been a pause in some of those big schemes, but I think thankfully, because of the ingenuity of the teams in TfL and in the boroughs, we've managed to leap ahead in some areas, while some areas have slightly paused or slowed down. And I think the challenge moving forward will be making sure that we continue and sustain some of the pace and the learning that we've been able to do with temporary materials, but also bring up the permanent materials and the permanent schemes to tackle some of those big challenges is going to be required in the future. There was one other piece. I've talked quite a lot about the infrastructure. There were other things, obviously, that associated with healthy streets. So the direct vision standard, for example, the new.
Will, I'm going to be coming on to that in a little bit. So yeah, I'll pause you there. So my next question is again for Heidi. How has the pandemic affected your key objectives in the MTS, which are about improving safety on the network?
So perhaps if I start with the road network, it's been quite a complex year because there's been fluctuations in traffic levels as we have moved our way through the different lockdowns. And whilst travel on the roads is down overall, and we have therefore seen fewer deaths and serious injuries than previous years. But I think that is largely a reflection of the fact that there is lower travel. I think we have seen the risk per journey increasing during lockdown. So we've seen different behaviours. We've seen people speeding on emptier roads, and the Metropolitan Police have done a lot of work to try and tackle that. We've also had to do things which we would rather not have done, but had to do for social distancing reasons. So we had to suspend cycle training, for example, and I think I'm right in saying that that's back up and running now. And the sort of stop-start nature of the funding has meant that some of the things we would have liked to have progressed really quickly on, sometimes simple things such as pedestrian crossings or the rollout of new speed cameras, some of those things haven't been able to go at the pace that we would have liked to have seen them going at. But as Will actually, I think, was about to say, and I don't want to steal his thunder, we haven't slowed down on the things that we can do that aren't dependent upon finances. So the fact that the direct vision standard is up and running now really will be saving people's lives. It has already made tens of thousands of lorries safer, and I do think it's right to say that there will be people alive at the end of this year who wouldn't have been alive had we not brought the direct vision standard in. So I think that's good. We've also got phase 2 of our lower speed limits work underway. You'll remember that pre-COVID, we had made all the roads within the congestion charging zone 20 miles per hour. We're continuing that work because we've got a programme to make 140 kilometres of roads across London in high risk areas, 20 mile per hour. And so we're doing the design work on that programme now, and we've already put new speed limits in, I think on Park Lane, Euston Road and Hampstead Road. So we are still moving forward where we can. I guess the only other thing I'd say about the network more generally, I've talked about the roads, is that, and I think I alluded to this in my opening comments, the work that the government is requiring us to do to look at our capital programme, which was required in the funding deal that we did in October, actually requires us to model up to the 30% cut in our capital programme. And that would be very, very significant. And in fact, I think it would be quite reckless to see that level of cut in the capital programme, and you couldn't deliver it without hugely impacting upon the experience of people travelling in London. We've got major assets, things like the Rotherhithe Tunnel, the Westway, that will actually need to be repaired for safety reasons in the near future. And Andy will be able to talk to you about the importance of the maintenance and renewals programme on rolling stock and on the track. And so I did just want to mention to Assembly members, because I think it's something that you should be aware of, that government has asked us to do this work. We're making the safety case as to why these things are absolutely essential. It's something that I'm quite concerned about at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the impact of lack of maintenance on Hammersmith Bridge, and then that being closed for on safety grounds. So yes, I mean, if something like the Westway wasn't going to get the investment it needed, I can see that would have an absolutely enormous impact on travel in the whole of West London. So thank you for kind of, yes, sharing your concerns on that. In terms of Vision Zero and delivering on these these bigger, more dangerous, hostile junctions, we actually had a motion in the Assembly last week, which obviously the Mayor hasn't yet responded to, but we were calling for something very simple for a crossing on every arm of every signalised junction. Can I just ask you to, give, and I don't know which of the three of you would want to answer on that, but is that something that you think that you will be able to help with, because it is something that Londoners, had unanimous support across the Assembly as a call, and it is something that Londoners find really difficult when they come to a signalised junction where there are signals for vehicles but not for pedestrians. Andy, Will, do you want to come in?
Could I start on that? And I'm sure Andy and Heidi want to come in. One, thanks. I think that this is a huge concern. The safety, we've always been clear that it's not just about making cycling safer, but safer for pedestrians, and particularly as we get a slightly older population, or people become more vulnerable on for crossing roads. I can't remember. I know that over the last few years, there's over 700 crossings now that do have pedestrian crossings. So there is work. I do want to assure people that there is an awful lot of work going on in this. And I know it's simple to say it, but actually delivering things on the street cannot always be simple, whether that's, as you talked about before, the share of road space on the roads, but also the way that London's roads are managed in terms of highway authority. So this is not just an issue for TfL, but it's also an issue for the boroughs. And so there can be crunchy targets here. So I think we do need more pedestrian crossings. I want to give Andy a bit of credit, actually. He's been down on site on one on Chelsea Embankment, where there was recently a fatality, and I think Andy did a brilliant job of the borough and TfL now working together to tackle that challenge. And quite often these things can end up in sort of, you know, a sort of gridlock between different highway authorities. Borough boundaries are a particular challenge in places, and so I think this is something that we all need to do more to work together on. But I do think that the Vision Zero approach and the target and the ambition is something that is driving change across the city. We recently developed a new dashboard. It's an online dashboard where you can break down the collision data, not just across all of London, but in terms of different boroughs and by different types of collision and different types of road user. That's all available on the TfL website. But I think this is going to be a really important tool for increasingly making the case that it's not just on the TfL big roads, but it's across all our roads, and we all do need to work together to try and tackle this. So, you know, I think it's been it has been the Vision Zero plan is absolutely instrumental. You can't have a healthy street if someone's going to be hit, or by definition, you can't have one that can be a healthy street where someone is unsafe or going to be hit by a car or a truck or something, or a motorbike user is going to be hit. That is not the definition of a healthy street. So the Vision Zero is absolutely integral to that part of the thing.
Andy, did you want to add something?
Well, thank you, and thank you, Will. I mean, it's a team effort. Will is also been very much part of that team. We continue to use data. At the end of the day, we can't fix everything immediately all at once. So you have to prioritize these things. And so we've got a very sophisticated now methodology whereby we do look at both historic accident data to see where the most problematic sites are. But also we consider other variables such as the levels of traffic and other geographical sort of layout issues in order to prioritize where we put our spend. So it is a very sophisticated model, and we are not going to let up on progressively tackling each outstanding intersection or junction that gives us concern. And just on that one at Battersea, I mean, I did go down there and I had a look. It was the south side of Battersea Bridge, and pretty much straight away, to your point, I just saw people taking a chance because there wasn't a signalled pedestrian crossing. Literally, they were watching the lights to see when the lights changed in one direction, and you had literally maybe a couple of seconds to run the gauntlet and get across the street before the next wave of traffic was coming towards you. That's not acceptable. So although we've always got to be careful, and this is a real mantra of mine, that you don't inadvertently introduce secondary risk. In other words, by fixing one problem, you cause another, particularly another safety risk. You've got to think these things through. Again, back to the point I gave in response earlier to Dr. Moore. One thing that we have, I think, got better at is being much more dynamic in our decision making. No messing about. We very rapidly got together with local elected officials and council officials, and we have come up with a scheme to fix that. And now we'll be on to the next location.
Yeah, thank you. You talked earlier as well about a safe system, and I just wanted to pick up and talk to you about the Direct Vision standard, and just if you could just talk to us a bit about what you see as the expected impact of that Direct Vision standard.
Well, I think it's really exciting, and it's yet another piece of groundbreaking activity that's happening here in London. Hot on the heels of things like the ULEZ and various other world firsts. That DVS is, I think, going to be a real game changer. I mean, at the end of the day, sometimes I feel a bit sorry for truck drivers because it's not an easy gig being in a big vehicle where if the vehicle isn't laid out so in order that you can see what's around you, be that pedestrians or cyclists. That is tough, and the same for my bus drivers. So rather than just bemoan the fact, we've worked really hard to come up with a standard that to which we expect now all vehicles to comply. I think it is groundbreaking. It means that each cab meets a certain standard in terms of the peripheral vision and what you can see in your wing mirrors and the actual design of the cab in terms of the depths of the windscreen, etc., etc. And we're also backing that up with training. I went down to Shepherd's Bush garage the other day to have a go at myself, have a go at the virtual reality head. You basically put on a headset. It's all very RoboCop, right? But you put on a headset and you can see by looking around what's around you. But at one point we put up a scenario which showed what a driver would be able to see with DVS and what they would be able to see without DVS. And it was quite striking, actually, that with the equipment on, you were suddenly aware of someone who was completely invisible to you when you were in the non-DVS mode. So we're very excited about it. It's the way of the future. It's another first for London, and I'm glad that we're doing it.
Yes, and are you? Oh, sorry, Will. Did you want to
just add one thing on the DVS? That it's insane that the largest 12-ton trucks around the world are not designed being able to adequately see out of this. It's madness that we in London had to come up with a plan to deliver this. Nobody builds a truck for London. Nobody builds a truck for the UK. They're built for international markets. Volvo build it for their European market, Asda Man and all the other ones. So what I think is really inspiring on this is that London's work and the work that the TfL team have done on this is not just, it's as of the 1st of March, it is changing journeys and changing lives within London, whether that's people walking, cycling or motorcycling. The trucks will be safer because of the standards there. But what's great is that the European Commission started looking at our work and have written it into European legislation. And while we are obviously no longer part of the European Union, Volvo are still making trucks according to European regulations to span out for the whole continent. So by 2028, the problems will be starting to be designed out of the system in terms of from the way the trucks are made. And today, the UN are looking at this approach to look at this as an international standard. Yeah. So the benefits that London have brought forward and the inspiring innovations that Andy's team have brought forward are actually rippling out globally. And people are suddenly waking up to the fact, this is mad. In a car, you've got standards on what you can see out of. But for the most dangerous vehicles, the heaviest vehicles on the road, there are no standards. How on earth has that happened? And so it really is an inspiring piece that I think all of London, and I know the Assembly have played a role in this. I know the Mayor, I know that there have been so many players, so many campaigners who've been asking for this. And sadly, quite a lot of victims of people who've been injured or have lost family members have been absolutely instrumental. So I think it's credit to a much wider group than just the small team who've got the technical expertise to deliver something so difficult.
I was absolutely going to say that. I was thinking in particular of Kate Cairns, the sister of Ailey Cairns, who's campaigned so much on with the See Me Save Me campaign for visibility from lorries, big lorries and trucks, and also obviously the work with Road Peace. I remember being taken in a cement mixer with Cynthia from Road Peace a few years ago before I came onto the Assembly to experience what it was like being in the cab of one of these very, very big lorries. And it was absolutely shocking how little could be seen, and also how distracting all the sensors are as well. So the more that we can make it so that there is just clear direct vision from the cab, the safer it will be. But that's brilliant to hear. London is such a world leader on this and rippling out. I've got one more question, which is for you, Will, which is about the kind of thinking about the ultra low emission zone and the rollout of the ultra low emission zone. That's going to be doing some good work to clean up the vehicles on the road. But I wonder what specific additional transport measures you're thinking about to help to reduce air pollution. And I wonder in particular, because the Environment Committee has done a report recently on air pollution, which is actually with the Mayor at the moment, but we suggested that there should be a review of the red routes. And I just wondered if you could just talk about, yes, sort of what you're doing in terms of additional transport measures, and in particular, if there's anything, if you've got any thoughts about what could be done along the red routes to help with air pollution.
I won't comment on that report yet, because obviously there's some work being done to respond properly on that, and I wouldn't want to jump on other people's toes. I suppose, there are two ways in my head. There are two approaches on how you reduce air quality. We know that, we improve air quality, we reduce pollution. know that the road vehicles are the biggest cause of air pollution, and they're also one of the most significant contributors to carbon emissions and to climate change. So there are two things we need. We need fewer vehicle journeys, yeah, and of those journeys, no one's being naive enough and no one believes that we can't have vehicle journeys, but we need those vehicles that are moving around to be cleaner, yeah. And so I suppose the first half of that is very much sort of part of my portfolio, the mode shift piece, and supporting people to think twice about, well, what journey should I make by a car and what journey should I maybe walk or cycle? And I think that the school run is, today my daughter went back to school for the first time in ages, thank goodness for her health and ours. And I know a lot of Londoners around the city are celebrating this. But it's madness that every morning in London, 250,000 car journeys associated with the school run. Now, a lot of those, not all of them, a lot of those are local journeys that could be done in another way. Yeah, nobody's saying they all could. And so I look towards our school streets programme, yeah, which essentially create a temporary closure around schools at sort of drop off and pick up time. And I sort of look to and suddenly we've got over 300 of these across the city. And I've looked at, actually, it's in Joanne's constituency, but there is a school in Enfield that someone shared the data from this, and where they've got cycle tracks nearby and school streets, 28% fall in car use, yeah, in this school in 1 year. 7% increase in walking, I think it's about an 8% increase in cycling, and then a 10% increase in scooting and skateboarding, because that's clearly what's cool these days. But it's initiatives like that of trying to stop those shorter journeys, which is a key part of that road, that first point around how do we make our fewer journeys by using polluting vehicles. And then I suppose the other piece is how do we make those vehicles cleaner? Now, clearly the ULEZ, what is it? Andy and Heidi know this stuff far more than I do, but it's reduced the amount of pollution in central London by about a half, hasn't it? It's been hugely successful in terms of that outcome. And clearly in October, expanding that out to the North and South Circular will benefit many, many more Londoners, but also has a knock-on effect because people will be using cleaner vehicles because they know there's restrictions outside of the ULEZ zone. I know TfL has been working really hard to improve the emissions from the bus fleet. So I think, and Andy can stand me corrected on this, that all 9,000 of the core buses that are now on our roads of the core fleet meet the Euro 6, the cleanest emissions standards. And clearly, as we move into buying more electric vehicles, that will get cleaner and cleaner. So there's, from my perspective, there are two aspects to this. One is fewer polluting journeys, and those journeys that we do need to be made by car or by a truck or by van need to be cleaner. But if I have to admit, the real experts probably on this call are, particularly in terms of cleaning up the vehicles, are Heidi and Andy. And so I will ask them to come in if that's okay, because I might be on uncertain ground on some of that.
Like, you've got it right, Will, so don't, you were totally spot on. And yeah, there has been huge progress made in terms of cleaning up the bus fleet. You are right that all of the core fleet is now Euro 6 or better. We've got, I think, about 400 electric buses operating on our streets with a plan to have 700 by the end of the year. We're making the case to government as to why they should support us with funding to upgrade the power supplies to the bus garages across London, because that's the sort of first part of the process that you need to get underway with. We, of course, strengthened the LES requirements as well, which apply to heavy goods vehicles, coaches, buses at the Greater London boundary. And so that strengthening has come in the last week or so. And, we are still, we have money available for black taxis who've had a horrendous year this year. And, whilst it might not be top of the list of things for them at the moment, the delicensing fund still exists. We still have the ability to support them with payments to purchase a zero emission capable vehicle. We've got tougher standards coming in as well with respect to the emissions performance of private hire vehicles over the next couple of years. So progressively, we're making sure that all the vehicles that are out on London streets are becoming cleaner. And the only other thing I would say about air pollution, of course, is that you'll be aware that TfL is doing a feasibility study into the potential for a Greater London boundary charge for non-residents. And certainly early analysis suggests that such a charge might reduce the number of vehicle movements over the Greater London boundary by 10 to 15%. That would have a knock-on impact with respect to air pollution. And one of the things that TfL is looking at in this feasibility study is whether there might be a higher charge for the most polluting vehicles. And so it would be interesting to get the feedback from that feasibility study as well. But all of that would play into the quality of the air in Outer London in particular, which we've seen some reports recently, haven't we, where there are some parts of Outer London where, you know, air pollution is still comparatively high. And so it will be interesting to interrogate the results of that feasibility study on the Greater London boundary charge for non-residents.
When do you expect to get that feasibility study back?
I think that'd be later in this summer or into the autumn. That was the latest feedback that I had from Alex Williams and his team.
Thank you. Thank
So
you.
that's correct. Just to confirm, that is correct. That's the time frame. And if I might just add, just very briefly, a couple of other points. We're also making good progress on our own non-revenue fleet, and by non-revenue fleet, I mean, dust carts and vans and other vehicles that we use, TfL vehicles, progressively getting them to be electric. We also met our target in terms of adding additional charging points around the city. There was a target to add 300 more charge points, and we met that. And just, if I may, one point I forgot to mention on the Direct Vision standard, by the way, was big shout out. I did want to do a big shout out to Sarah Hope. And the Sarah Hope line, I've had the honour and pleasure of meeting with Sarah a couple of times recently. She's a remarkable woman, and she is really helping my understanding of collisions, what more can be done to avoid collisions, but more specifically, what can be done to help the victims of collisions. And of course, she and her mother and her daughter, Pollyanna, were themselves victims of a collision, and we are going to relaunch that line and really promote it later this summer as soon as the lockdown eases. So big shout out to Sarah.
Well, and that's very good to hear that you're going to relaunch.
Absolutely.
We did a visit to the Sarah Hope line, and that is, those of us who visited, that's very, very good news. Thank you. Chair, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, that's okay. We have a confusion because I've got two microphones running and one is switched off. So thank you. I had the dubious pleasure of my computer deciding to restart itself during that set of questioning. So it's happened seamlessly without you noticing. Andy, thank you very much for that, and particularly thank you for the shout out to Sarah Hope, who I know is listening today and has contributed some information into this meeting. So I know she'll be really pleased to hear that. So thank you. If we can now move on, there are three questions from Assembly Member Keith Prince.
Thank you, Chair. I didn't indicate because I did want to come in on something that Heidi said actually, but can I congratulate you, Heidi, on Women's Day of having being a high-profile woman and holding the position you do. I mean, I think it's great that we have examples like yourself to show that in London, women can progress. In fact, I noted that there are more women Assembly members today than there are men, actually.
There are indeed, and I would have commented on that, but thank you for doing it, Keith.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you for your kind words.
No, that's credit where it's due. So trying not to be combative on this one, actually, Heidi. So please take this in the way that it's meant. You mentioned the LEZ, and the problem that I've got in my neck of the woods, because obviously that's massively affected by the LEZ, is that I've actually got constituents writing to me saying that they are now out of a job because their vans don't comply. And the problem is that the scrappage scheme ran out of money. And I just wondered what you were going to be doing to fix that, what is a real problem.
Yeah, so you're right. We did see a great deal of demand for the van scrappage scheme once we restructured it. And one of the things that the Mayor has been able to do in setting his budget this year is to make a little bit more money available for scrappage in London. And so we had a number of vans that had applied for the scrappage scheme, but we had to put their application on hold until such time as we knew whether there would be money released by other people who had already deemed to be eligible for it, but hadn't actually then gone on to scrap their vehicle, because there's a dropout process where people are found to be eligible but then don't actually go on to scrap the vehicle, and so money flows back into the pot. So what we had said to a number of applicants was, we're going to hold your application pending. We will be able to go back to some of those applicants, given the money that the Mayor was able to find through setting his budget this year, to augment that. It won't clear the whole backlog of vans that are in the queue, but it will clear some of them, and hopefully it will be good news for those businesses that were waiting to hear whether they would actually get a scrappage payment. We have also seen quite a lot of interest in the car and motorcycle scrappage scheme that the Mayor launched as well. And so some of that recent money that the Mayor has allocated through the budget process will also go into the car and motorcycle scrappage scheme, to ensure that that continues to run. We've obviously got the expansion of ULEZ coming up in October, and so for Londoners who are on low incomes or who are in receipt of disability benefits, they're able to apply for a £2,000 payment to scrap their polluting car, and then it's up to them what they do with that money. They could purchase a compliant car, a car that meets the ULEZ emission standard, or they could choose to use that money to pay for public transport or to join a car club. The one thing that we have done over the last few years is make the case to government for them to match the scrappage schemes that we have in place in London, because it's been proven to be popular. It's been proven to take polluting vehicles off the road, and it's been proven to support businesses and support the recovery. And I think that that's going to be really important going forward. And so it's a shame that government hasn't matched the funding that the Mayor has put in, but we will continue to make that case.
I mean, I totally agree. I think the scrappage scheme is a very good scheme, very good initiative, and I think I did congratulate the Mayor on it. But it is very disappointing, although I understand that there are people in my constituency, I'm not trying to score any points, but who generally can't work now, and I directed them to the scrappage scheme a while ago, and they've just said it's closed, and from what you're telling me is it's not actually going to reopen again. It's only going to try and deal with the backlog, or some of the backlog, but there's actually you're not going to be able to reopen the scrappage scheme. I think that's a bit of a shame.
Well, we are in a very, very difficult financial situation, and you will appreciate that. And, you know, had COVID not hit, had TfL's finances perhaps been in a rosier state than they are at the moment, we might be able to look at how you can shift budgets around. Unfortunately, that is not an option that is available to us at the moment, given how we're dealing with the impact of COVID.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you anyway, Heidi. Thank you for answering the question. Okay, so now I'm going to move to Mr. Byford. So what specific actions is TfL taking to address new and emerging safety issues caused by the pandemic? For example, the increase in speeding offences due to roads being quieter in certain areas, and a more complex mix of road users, increasing micro and cycling pedestrians. Some interference there.
Sure, that might have been me. Sorry, rustling my papers. I had come off mute already, but I think I got the gist
You
of
do that to
it.
me all the time, man. It's all right, don't worry about it.
Sorry about that. Right, I mean, we've got a very good relationship with the Metropolitan Police in terms of tackling speeding on roads. I actually had the pleasure to go out with them one night, which was really fun. It was quite exhilarating, actually, because we were going out to check on speeding on the Westway. So they're using their various equipment, onboard equipment, to get reports of speeding and to test vehicles for their prevailing speed, and then taking action to progress that. And as Heidi said earlier, there is a bit of an alarming trend in that people have been speeding. It's not unique to London. It's a bit of an issue across the rest of the country as well, that people have taken advantage in some cases of slightly less busy streets to treat it as a bit of a racetrack. And that's just not acceptable with the safety risks that presents. So obviously some of it's enforcement, working with the Metropolitan Police, but then also more proactive measures such as lowering speeds and reducing speeds on the TLRN within the congestion charging zone. We've introduced 20-mile-an-hour speed limits on an additional 20 kilometres of London streets as part of Street Space. And phase 2 of the programme will reduce the posted speed limit by 10 miles an hour on more than 140 kilometres of our roads in high-risk areas. That plus a big marketing push to make sure that people do understand that it's not acceptable, that there are penalties and that there is enforcement out there. We will not take our eye off this ball. We're going to keep the pressure on because of the risks that we're facing.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot more police activity. I use the A12 a lot and the A406 a lot. Mm-hmm. And I've seen, cars, I've seen, first of all, motorcycle traffic cops with their speed guns.
Yeah.
See, actually, and also I've seen cars being pulled over on a regular basis, and I think that's very good. They did do an operation on the A12, and they got quite significant results. No, Will, I can see you.
Keith, Will would like to come in.
I've just got to call out that exact operation. I was going to call out that exact operation on the A12 and on the A13. The police did a specific intelligence-led speeding target and actually reduced. On the A13, there were actually sort of an alarming number of fatalities and people killed and seriously injured, and instances of people racing there. And that operation that they did changed it completely. And I think it's a reflection on the partnership between TfL and the Met in terms of that road traffic policing, and how both organisations have bought into the Vision Zero approach. Is just how successful that's been. I know Her Majesty's Inspector of the Constabulary called it out as a success in a recent report. But what some of the data my friend in the Met shared with me was that between March to October last year, there had been almost a 200% increase in speeding report offences, tickets given from the previous year. Now, I know that speeding had gone up during the lockdown, but not by that much. And so the enforcement work that the Met have been doing in terms of how seriously they're taking this has increased enormously. And just amazing credit to them for working together in such good partnership.
Yeah.
And there's clearly been
it's a shame that the police don't get to retain the revenue from that, though, isn't it, in a way?
One thing, Keith, that I was so impressed with when I went out the night I went out with those guys was just how professional they were as well, the police. And we encountered, actually, it wasn't just Met, we also encountered City of London. And, it's often a conflict situation because people don't like to get pulled over. But the officers with whom I dealt that night were 100% professional and polite, but also assertive in how they went about their business. They were really a credit to the police service.
Yeah, I've been out on many operations, all different types, and I've always found them to be incredibly professional. And I think the body-worn cameras help tremendously, actually, because it not only means the police officer has to act in the correct way, which they tend to do anyway, but also the person who being filmed knows that all this is going to be submissible in court, and their attitude will count against them if they behave in a bad way. So, yeah. But anyway, I've got a couple of concerns, not so much around safety. With this extension of the 20 miles an hour, I can get it why you do it in central. But for instance, with my car, it's an automatic, and at 20 miles an hour, my car is horrendously polluting because it sticks in one gear below top, and it revs more So it revs at about 2,500 revs at 20 miles an hour, which is more than it does at 50 miles an hour. So it is burning fuel like it's going out of fashion.
Well, I mean, I guess that is where potentially there's a conflict in laudable objectives. Obviously, we want to reduce speed because there's a direct correlation with collisions and road safety. But equally, to your point, we want to improve air quality, and we want to improve the throughput of roads such that buses can get through and don't get stuck in horrendous congestion. So you're absolutely right. It is a sort of dynamic relationship, and one that we've got to get right. And as with, I'd say, anything we do at TfL, and I hope people would agree with this statement, the way I look at it, and certainly on my watch as your commissioner, nothing is intractable or set in stone. If there's something that needs to be revisited, we'll always take a look at it. I would always want to look at data rather than listen to anecdote. We would absolutely look and see if we've got it right, because sometimes two things, if not mutually exclusive, they can clash against each other, and you've got to get the balance right.
Oh, yeah, no, I agree with that. Just while we're on safety, though, we've seen from the ONS and the TfL data that bus drivers have twice the likelihood of dying from COVID per 100,000 than the most dangerous occupations. What is TfL doing about that?
Sure, and it is. It's a very complex issue, because it's not necessarily the case, and people have argued this, but it's not just because they are bus drivers. It's also the community from which they come in some ways. It's the background. The BAME community tends to attract a lot of bus drivers, and there's a certain vulnerability in the BAME community, it would appear, to COVID. Plus, obviously, the nature of the job does mean you have interaction with other people. There's a certain demographic with a potential for underlying conditions, but none of that should be seen as unsolvable. So we have been taking putting real attention on protecting the drivers in terms of their working environment. So we've sealed up the cabs. The actual driver's cab in terms of the flow of air. We had Imperial College in to do a study of the airflows to see what the dynamics were in terms of air movement, and where droplets or people's exhalation could invade the driver's cab. So that then led to the design by which we sealed those cabs. We have, at the very height of the pandemic, we introduced middle door boarding so that no one could board via the front door. We have taken extensive protection at depots, so one-way system in depots, social distancing in canteens, furloughing or not furloughing, putting on leave those people who are particularly vulnerable, those with underlying conditions. Really leaving no stone unturned to make sure that our bus operators, and for that matter other TfL staff, but specific to your question, that bus operators are properly protected, because not unique to London, I have to say, it's the same in New York City. There does seem to be a real cluster around bus operators, and it's certainly something that we're very concerned about.
Yeah, I've got two questions.
Assemblymember Prince, you've got two questions left in this section. Can I move you on a little, because we will run out of time?
I'll just quickly ask these two questions,
okay.
and then I'll move on.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. I appreciate it. Very quickly then, the TfL death rate is double that of the national average. Now, I accept that the profile of TfL bus drivers might be different to the national average, but what have you done in places like, let's say, Manchester, Liverpool, the big conurbations where there's likely, Bradford, where it leads, where there's likely to be a similar community profile to what we get in London? What comparisons have you done with those other big cities rather than the national, because we know that there isn't the same sort of community profile, but where there's a similar profile? Have you looked at any other cities and what?
Sure. So we do, and not just within the UK actually, Keith. We look across the whole transport family across the world. We are talking to sister organisations in the UK, sister organisations in the US, across Europe. just to see, is there something that we're missing? Is there something that we're missing in the design of the job or the nature of the protection that we're offering? And actually, in most cases, we are leading the way in terms of the steps we've taken. Certainly, things like sealing up the cabs. Other agencies have followed us rather than us following their lead. But we continue that dialogue. We are in active discussion across the UK and internationally to see what more can we do to protect our valuable, wonderful bus operators.
And then, Andy, very quickly, do you think that it was the right decision to scale back on physical site visits at the height of lockdown? I mean, there may be reasons for that, but clearly you were then not inspecting bus garages to make sure that they were ticking all the boxes.
Well, so we have been doing some safety inspections virtually. Actually, there is a way of doing that, but I certainly advocate there's nothing better than an actual on-site visit, walking the job, using a checklist, talking to the local health and safety rep, looking at what the conditions are, making corrective actions. I think there's no substitute for actually walking the route and checking the and talking to the operators themselves. So, we are where we are, but I'm a big fan of and a big supporter of on-site inspections. That to me, that's the best way of doing the job.
Okay.
And if I might intercede, Andy,
So,
it is correct to say, and Heidi may have something to say on this, but you worked very closely with the unions during that period as well.
We did, and I'd like to thank them actually for the fact that they were so professional and they remain so in our common objective. That is, and there's no politics around this. This is a common objective that we want to keep their members, our colleagues, safe and healthy.
And they were very often your eyes and ears in bus garages.
They were, and they don't hold back, and neither should they. They've got legal obligations, and so do we. Where a rep raised an issue, we were straight onto it, be that a generic issue across a number of sites or a site-specific concern or even relating to a particular type of vehicle or whatever. In no instance did we ignore that. We immediately took action.
Thank you very much. Keith, would you like to take your final two questions in this section?
Yeah, I would have said something, but I'll let it go. Okay, so given that car speeds have increased with fewer vehicles and that, we want to move on to an 80% sustainable transport mode, do you think that will increase this problem?
When you say this problem, what do you mean?
Sorry. Do you
Speeding.
think I tried to shorten the question, I failed.
Sure.
Do you think by having a more sustainable transport mode, ergo fewer vehicles on the road, that could be greater?
Well, I think in any good strategy, you've always got to think through the what-if scenarios, and certainly, if you just freed up the roads, freeing up the roads is obviously a good thing in terms of getting the buses moving more freely, which in itself attracts people onto the buses. So you get a virtuous upward spiral rather than a downward spiral. But yeah, you're absolutely right that if what you don't want to do is inadvertently create a open road racetrack for people. And so our focus with the Metropolitan Police Service and our enforcement will continue, and to your point, may even need to be further tightened.
Okay, I'll leave that there. And then finally, what action can be taken to reduce the number of deaths by motorcyclists, given that 2020, the number equaled the number from 2019, despite the London being in lockdown for large parts of that year?
Sure. So, there's a number of things that we're doing. We're now resuming our training courses, which I know as a cyclist yourself that you would be supportive of. So we are giving people training on riding motorcycles. We continue to apply guidance from what's called the Urban Motorcycle Design Handbook to embed motorcycle safety. We are continuing with compulsory basic training requirements, talking to wider representative groups and organisations to find out, what more they feel that we should be doing to promote rider safety. We heard earlier on about the direct vision standards, so where trucks are overtaking bikes, there's a direct improvement for motorcycle and moped riders. And generally, also looking at data to see where there are specific sites that have particular dangers for motorcyclists, so that we can then introduce further corrective measures, be that reducing the speed, changing the layout of a junction, providing better protection, advanced starts for cyclists, that kind of thing.
I'd like to take this opportunity actually to thank Heidi for chairing the round table that we had, and hopefully we will have more sessions on that, because I thought that's quite constructive. And we've identified 5 sites, I think it was, wasn't it, Heidi, that we're going to have a look at when we can.
Will, you wanted to come in?
Keith, I think that Stuart Reid, who attended that session with us from TfL, has organised a sort of virtual roundtable with the right people from different parts of TfL to work with the Motorcycle Action Group on some of that, so that we can take that forward, even if we're actually not going out to individual sites to look at them. And I also just wanted to say that I think TfL is due to be launching a new marketing campaign around motorcycle safety in the next couple of weeks, because when you do look at the number of people who have been killed on the roads last year, there is a disproportionately high number of motorcyclists. And so getting both people that are driving cars as well as people on motorbikes to actually think about watching out for each other, and just thinking about actually this person might turn, etc. I think that will be at the heart of a new marketing campaign. So we are putting some effort into that, and I understand that the Motorcycle Action Group have been engaged in that process and have fit into it as well. So I think that's a positive thing.
Thank you, Heidi. And I know Will Norman has been signalling to try to come in and make a comment.
Just, Keith, I know we talked about this before, and I know you've offered to take me out on your bike, and we haven't been able to do that because of COVID, but I have been digging into this a bit. And, disproportionate, the Heidi mentioned about the disproportionate number of motorcycle riders, but actually it's within that. 45% of all the KSIs are people under 29 years old. And I think that how it affects particular types of particular communities, particular age groups, is a particular concern. And one of the worries I have is that we need to change the overall culture of safety within motorcycling, particularly with the compulsory basic training. And I don't feel personally that is adequate to, you don't need to, it doesn't need theory or practical test. You can go out on the, you can do your training and go off and ride around on a 125 motorbike, which can actually do some pretty scary speeds, particularly young people. So one of the things that I've been doing is actually talking to government ministers to try and increase the, the provision at a national level in terms of motorcycle training, because I do think that this is a concern more widely, not just in London, but actually in different cities as well.
Yeah. Will, Andy, Heidi, I mean, what I really would like to see is that we get into bed with the delivery companies, because the majority of these KSIs are going to be young people who are taking up a job with the delivery company. They're probably not even their own bike. And I think we should try and find a way of getting some kind of voluntary code. So sort of just lean on these, the Deliveroos and the Ubers and the others, the big boys, if you like, to see if we can't get them to have a voluntary code, which means that these motorcyclists have to attain a slightly higher level of competence. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Will. Heidi.
That didn't we, when met with the Motorcycle Action Group, Keith, and that's something that I'm happy to take away and look into. I do think we should look at the data though as well, because to sort of try and understand, and I think there may be some limitations on the data about the number of people who are being killed and seriously injured on motorbikes whilst at work. And I'd like to develop a bit more of an understanding about whether that really is the problem. Is what we should be doing is focusing our efforts, in the areas to make the most difference. But certainly in principle, that would be something I'd be happy to take away and consider.
Okay, thank you. I think that's it for me then.
Thank you very much, Keith, Assembly Member Prince, and thank you for some very fruitful comments from our speakers. We're now running a little bit behind, so I just want to put everyone on slightly on warning and in the nicest possible way and move on to the next set of questions, which are coming from Assembly Member Caroline Pidgeon. And it's not a serious delay, but we're just trying to keep people to time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have got a few issues that I want to cover. The bulk of my questions are for the Commissioner today, and then at the end of my section, I might just come to you, Deputy Mayor, just to get your take on the issues that I'm raising. So, Commissioner, how has the pandemic affected progress against the Mayor's Transport Strategy objective, which is to deliver a good public transport experience?
Okay. Well, I think in the short term, we heard some of this earlier on. In the short term, it has meant that we have had to focus more than ever on the basic hygiene factors, if you like, of getting people's confidence up to come back to transport or in the future, but certainly for those people who are reliant upon it, to make sure that they feel safe. In that it's a socially distanced service, it's clean, and that it is controlled. We've had a lot of success in that, but it's not been easily won. I mean, to provide social distancing, we need to provide at or near full service, and we've been doing that. The Tube is something like a 90% schedule being run at the moment, which is difficult because there's a lot of operators who are actually forced, they want to come to work, but they're forced to stay off at the moment, and service control staff, because they've been identified as clinically extremely vulnerable. But it's absolutely essential that we do maintain our focus on that, and we keep the service clean, as I've said, and that we also enforce and make sure that people are wearing masks. But more long term, the only way that we will continue to be able to provide a decent and attractive service is if we receive adequate funding, and I can't stress that enough. So we're completely beholden to government in the short term. We've got to get these bailouts, and we're grateful for the two we've had.
Later.
Sure, but my only point is there's a direct correlation between having the right level of funding and the pleasant ambient service that was the gist of your question. So I think we still are providing a good public transport experience, but to keep doing that, we need to have the funding.
Great. So I didn't want to cut you off, just so I'm mindful of what the Chair said, and I've got some more questions on that later on. Can we go into some specifics then? How do you think the pandemic has impacted on improving accessibility on London's transport network?
Well, we're very committed to that. We still absolutely, it's a bit of a passion of mine, actually. It was in Toronto and New York City, that you can't really be proud of a transport system unless and until it's accessible to everyone. And otherwise you are literally precluding people, excluding people from the service. So the good news is we're now up to 81 stations with step-free access. Places like Amersham and Cockfosters have just become accessible. And there's a further 6 opening in the next financial year. But with the finance that I know you want to come on to, our ability to continue funding step-free access programs is going to be severely limited, depending on which of these scenarios, the capital reduction scenarios that we're forced to submit to. Having said that, it's not all bad news. Crossrail is on the horizon. We're hopefully going into trial running shortly. And of course, every single one of the Crossrail stations will be accessible, rightly so. We have continued to provide dial-a-ride services for older and disabled customers. We've launched the TfL Go app, which is really good. Anyone out there who hasn't got it yet, please do get it because it's excellent. And it does show you at a glance what the availability is of accessible stations, things like lift status, for example. Is the lift working or isn't it? So we're very much committed to accessibility still. But again, I do flag there's dark clouds on the horizon with regard to funding.
Okay, there were 12 tube stations due to be fully accessible by March 2020. You've mentioned the 3 that have already opened, which are welcome. You've mentioned the 6 which are now quite seriously delayed. There are 3 that are paused. If they were due to be opened in March 2020, that isn't down to COVID, is it? Something else must have been going wrong in the system for you to pause, which I assume effectively means cancel on those additional 3. Could you give us some more information on those?
Yeah, I'd have to look up the specifics, but I mean, there's been a number of factors in a number of the schemes whereby we found problems on site, or there's been other reasons where we've had to put a temporary stop on the schemes. I mean, in some cases, COVID was a factor because we literally couldn't maintain safe distanced working in a lift shaft. We just couldn't do it because the people would be working into close proximity. But what I will do is I will send you a note to set out specifically on those 3 sites. We'll send you a note to say what the specific reasons were for those 3.
That would be really helpful. And then also in terms of accessibility, throughout much of the lockdown, physical assistance for disabled people travelling with TfL services has been withdrawn. I raised it with you before, you apologised. It came back on, then it was taken off again. I think it's now currently available. Why is it that TfL has not been able to consistently run this service, yet all the private train companies have managed to? Is it that the unions don't want to? Is it some other complexity? I really feel for blind and visually impaired people and other people with disability who need that extra bit of help around the system. Nobody's travelling at the moment because they really want to. They've perhaps got to get to an appointment. Perhaps it is they're going to work and they need that. I just think it's for London not to be providing that service. And you have personally apologised for it. For me, it's unacceptable. And I just wanting to know what's going on there. What are you doing to resolve that?
Yeah, sure. So in every case where we have found that that service hasn't been forthcoming, I've had the Chief Customer Officer look into it because I share your dismay and anger, really, that we've not been able to provide that service. Now, clearly, we need to make sure equally that our members of staff, our colleagues are protected, but we are talking about assistance to vulnerable people. So in each instance that there has been a report that service less than optimal has been provided, in other words, we haven't given the special service that we should be doing, we've had the Chief Customer Officer look into the circumstances. Sometimes they're not as clear-cut as they might appear to be, but it's certainly something I feel as strongly as you about, and I don't expect people not to get the assistance they need.
But twice it has not been available for significant periods of time at all. It's not just the occasional bad experience, it's not been available. What are you doing to ensure that it's always going to be available?
Well, I mean, it is available again now. Equally, though, respectfully, I have to make sure that my colleagues are protected. I can't force people to provide very intimate, close-range assistance if they don't feel comfortable. So again, it's about getting that balance right. We want to absolutely provide the assistance that, say, a blind person needs, but equally, I have a duty of care to my employees. I've got to make sure that we are providing the right protections for them such that they can then provide that assistance without putting themselves at risk.
Okay, well, I do think there's something for you to look at outside of this, that if train companies have managed to provide it safely, then I think TfL should. One of the positive things that we long called for as a committee, I've called for, was Thameslink going back on the map, because it's a fully accessible service in the central core bit. Fantastic service, complementary to Crossrail, of course, when we get that open. Gone on the tube map in this period, what are you doing to guarantee that it will be on the map after the COVID period?
Well, I remember when it was first raised with me, and it was shortly into my tenure, actually, someone said, do you have a problem with us putting Thameslink on the map? And I said, absolutely not. To me, it's a bit of a no-brainer. There were various reasons put up as to why it hadn't been in the past, that it was seen as some sort of precedent. If we put Thameslink on, everyone else will want it. To me, there's a sort of unique case to be made for Thameslink. It's very much a central London service. It's a key element of the map. So as far as I'm concerned, it's on and it's not coming off. So I will, though, we'll properly confirm that when when the decision time comes up, but I would certainly not support taking it off. It's on, let's keep it on.
Wonderful. And could you make sure that all the stations do have it on the map? Because Brixton Station doesn't have an up-to-date map with Thameslink on, and I'm sure there are others as well. So
Yeah, we'll have a little once round. Yeah, we'll check it.
The other big issue I wanted to raise with you is around TfL's decision to stop cash payments at most of your underground stations, and I think overground as well, possibly, but certainly underground. When are you going to return to a full cash service across all your stations?
Yet to be determined. It came off for valid reason. It was very much supported by the unions. We wanted to make sure that we did protect people, and it was one less touch point to be handling cash. But having said that, we do know that for some people that cash is the only alternative. So we are keeping this very much under review. We are at the moment, we're not expanding that any further, but those stations that don't currently handle cash will continue not to handle cash. As the lockdown lifts, it's something that we will look to update, and we'll keep you and the other Assembly members very closely apprised, because it is something that we know it does cause some problem for some customers.
Well, one of the points in your letter to the chair of the committee was it's protecting staff and customers from handling cash. Now, the Bank of England did a very detailed piece of work which showed that it wasn't a hazard at all. Risk from using money in terms of passing COVID is very low indeed. So I'm not quite understanding your concern there, given this Bank of England report. And therefore, I really would like to understand from you when we can see cash returning to all of the stations.
Sure. I haven't seen that report. I'd be interested in taking a look at it. But what I would say is, and it's been, I think, a factor throughout the whole pandemic, there is perception and there is reality. And a lot of people did express concerns about touch points and handling cash. So this was something that was considered back at the start of the pandemic. It was one of many actions that were taken to limit those touch points for the benefit of and the safety rather of our employees, but also of customers. But it's part of our recovery plan that it's something that we do need to review. When are we going to bring it back? And obviously Assembly members will be consulted on that, as will, for that matter, London Travel Watch and other groups. And
you definitely plan to bring cash back?
We've got that under review. We haven't planned to not bring it back, but I don't want to say when, because this is such a moving feast that I don't want to do something and then regret it and then have to take it out again. You know, this is something that we're going to keep under very close review.
Thank you. If I could just go to the Deputy Mayor, Heidi, whether you might want to comment on the accessibility thing, because that has been disappointing, but also the cash payments, how you feel about that, and whether you can commit that you want to bring cash back as soon as it's safe to do so, or you see it safe to do so, onto the stations that you manage.
Clearly, I have a concern for vulnerable users of the public transport network and people that might not have cards and Oyster cards. And so I do think we're going to have to look at this review very carefully when that piece of work is done. In terms of accessibility, I totally understand where you're coming from on this, because there is nothing that I would like to see more than us making sure that the public transport system is accessible to everyone. I am aware, and this predated Andy's arrival at TfL, that on the step-free access programme, we did encounter a very significant number of difficult hurdles with the delivery of that programme. We discovered lots of utilities, as Andy talked about. I think there were some problems with lift suppliers at one point in time. And so even pre-pandemic, if I'm honest, the programme was behind. And I think those 3 stations that you were talking about, that Andy's going to provide you with a more detailed report on, that are paused, I think those were the latter stations in the existing programme. And so we had hoardings up at the stations, we'd had planning permissions in place, but it was just the case that they were the last three in the programme. In terms of the Turn Up and Go service, this is something that I have spoken to Mark Evers at TfL about as well. It is my understanding that one of the reasons that this has perhaps taken a bit longer in TfL than it has done with the mainline train operating companies is the particular circumstances in which Turn Up and Go may be offered in an underground setting. Clearly the vast majority of train stations that the TOCs operate through are above ground, they're in the open air. If you think of some of our really old tube stations in central London where you can't get down to the platform unless there's a lift, where there's very congested environments, that actually the physical closeness and intimacy is something that perhaps feels is a bit tighter and more constrained than it would be on platforms in the open air. And so, the second time this has happened, my understanding is that we wanted to go through a thorough risk assessment around the new variants. And so this is something I wanted to reassure you that I have taken a personal interest in this, because it is something that concerns me as well. And we are committed to doing absolutely everything we can to make sure that the public transport network is there for everyone.
Lovely. Thank you very much for your answers, and thank you, all three of you, for what you've been doing throughout this pandemic.
Thank you, Assembly Member Pigeon. Now, I had two people who'd indicated that they might want to come in. So the first is Assembly Member Shah.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I want to pick up issue about one specific station, and won't surprise Heidi, I'm sure, and that's about Harrow on the Hill station. Because there's the one which, after 15 years of campaigning, we managed to get the work started. So are you able to tell me whether what is happening, what is the status of completion of Harrow on the Hill station project itself? Do you want to answer that first, please?
Yeah, the work on Harrow on the Hill is very complex. I've visited that station with you, and I've seen some of the pictures of the work that is having to be done in order to get the lift shafts down onto some of the platforms there. But that is work that is going to be completed. It's one of the 6 stations that Andy referenced when he said that the work was going to be completed in this financial year. And so that work is ongoing and it will be done. I know there are 2 sides from which you access Harrow on the Hill station, and so I won't get into the complexities of one.
Except about the other side, which is impossible. Yeah. I don't have issue of that at the moment, though it will be part of our continuing campaign to get that in process when we can.
Understood.
But I'm keen to see that what has been taken on board is completed. It's just that I didn't see any reference to that in the paperwork that I received, so I thought I better raise it because there's still a very, very live issue. Moving on to the other aspect, which quite rightly Commissioner has raised or indicated that because of funding crisis, obviously the program we had cannot go ahead in terms of step-free access. But there is reference to external funding. Can we elaborate a bit more on that in terms of, are we simply talking about third-party funding in terms of any funds which come through TfL property development, or is there anything else that you're looking at to attract external funding which we can invest for step-free access?
Primarily, I think it is about third-party funding, but the discussion that we're having with government about our overall capital programme will obviously determine the extent to which we are able to continue at pace with accessibility improvements at stations. And so it's those 2 elements.
Again, if I might just add to that we continue to very, very aggressively push with developers where where a developer has aspirations to build somewhere, then we always try to leverage a contribution, sometimes 100%, but a contribution towards making a station accessible. That's something that immediately comes to our attention whenever someone's interested in building.
Commissioner, I fully appreciate, you, as you said, your passion for accessibility of public transport. You already mentioned, I think, dial-a-ride and a couple of other things in terms of how we can continue to improve and provide accessibility. But holistically, there are other things that can be done in terms of accessibility, which doesn't require large amount of funding. And those are the areas like the signage, like improving some of the public realm facilities, better staffing access at stations, manual ramps provision, which I think is lacking in some instances from some of the casework that I've come across, lifts, which could be better maintained, etc. Is this something that you would kind of prioritize in the sense or keep a focus? Because it is in the end about accessibility as well as good public transport experience.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and it's something that I have a lot of experience in doing. I mean, certainly in my time in New York, we really looked holistically at the whole accessibility piece, which, as you rightly say, isn't actually all about lifts. Lifts are important, putting in new ones, but also keeping the existing ones working, keeping them clean. But then there's a whole plethora of other things. Ramps, where ramps can be provided. A ramp doesn't break down; it's always available. Making sure you get your signage right, making sure that you've thought through all of the different types of disability, which some of which aren't always visible, but cognitive disability, oral disability, visual disability, making sure that your collateral is accessible. That, in other words, the actual documentation or your website, making sure your staff training is good enough. In New York, we did a trial station where we also used it as a test bed for trialing different products. Like there's some very clever IT systems now whereby you can get the device of your choice, so an iPhone or whatever, to talk to you, to basically guide you around the station. Or you can use other wayfinding points around the station, again, for those people who've got visual impairment. So we're brimming with ideas, and they need not all be as expensive or time consuming as installation of elevators, although that is really important.
And just finally, a comment about cash payment at stations. I hope that when completion of review, we can go back to reinstating cash payment, because there's another issue. Time and again, I come across where people are asking, why is this happening? Why can we not have that access to pay or choice to pay by cash? So I hope that...
I mean, don't forget, I mean, you can still use the machines, and there are also, there's a very big network actually of shops nearby tube stations where you can buy tickets. But I hear you. It is something that certainly when we do our review, I'll make sure that the quite strong views of Assembly members are taken into account.
Yeah, can I thank and Chair, that's all for me for now.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'm sure Andy Byford will be aware of the work that London Travel Watch did, and actually some of the distances to those pay points are prohibitive. Councillor Cabinet Member Russell, you indicated you might want to speak. It will need to be very brief because we do need to move on.
I will be very brief, Chair. Thank you. This is for the Commissioner, and I just wanted to raise, before we move on from this section on the pandemic and public transport, something in particular relating to transport workers' safety and sadly deaths during the pandemic. There was a piece in the FT at the weekend highlighting Uber drivers with COVID-19 symptoms going to pharmacies and asking for medicine to help them keep working during the first wave. Uber drivers, because they weren't classed as workers, had no access to sick pay. Now, that's clearly a public health risk, both to drivers and for their passengers. So in light of the recent Supreme Court ruling, what is TfL doing to protect these drivers and obviously public health in London?
Well, obviously, we have a onerous responsibility as the licensing authority to make sure that we provide, or we stipulate rather, for contractors such as Uber, that we stipulate standards that must be met. So we have put huge effort into provision of masks and of hand sanitizer for taxis. I'd have to look up the exact number, but we've handed out an enormous quantity of hand sanitizers and masks, both for the drivers and for their passengers.
Commissioner, I was thinking more in terms of making sure that they get their workers' rights so that they can afford to self-isolate and
Got it. Well, again, that's where our licensing responsibilities come in. We take a very intrusive approach to properly regulating Uber and others, and that includes things like making sure that they are providing proper safety, health and safety arrangements for their employees. So if you're aware of any specifics, I'd be happy to take them away, but I'm very confident that Helen Chapman and her team are all over this and holding Uber to their responsibilities.
I may write to you following up this meeting.
Sure. Thank you. I'll look out for that.
Thank you.
And it would be good to know that with the judgment made recently that you were able to follow that up and follow that through. But I think we'll leave that there. Thank you very much. And I'd like to move on to questions, another set of questions from Assembly Member McCartney.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is for the Deputy Mayor, if I can. And obviously the pandemic has affected your progress on delivering new homes and jobs. And I wonder if you could just outline that and perhaps what steps you're thinking of taking in the future to deal with those.
Yeah, okay. So Assembly members will be aware that TfL is actually one of the capital's largest landowners. We've got a lot of sites that could be developed for housing, and we have quite an extensive pipeline of planning applications now. So the pandemic has affected both the planning process, the actual construction that has been able to take place on sites, because all of our sites stopped during the first lockdown. It's also affected TfL's finances, obviously, and therefore the ability that we have to conclude commercial deals to build out the planning permissions that we've been given. So on a very practical level, we had to delay some of the works, for example, at Kidbrooke, where we are building with Notting Hill Genesis on some of the planning permissions, because the local authorities have said, well, we actually want more time to ensure proper consultation. We have worked quite collaboratively and pragmatically with local authorities to ensure that if people do have time to comment on schemes, we don't want to try and railroad things through. That's not what we're about. And so we haven't been able to meet the initial target that TfL set for itself about the number of starts on site that it would have. And we're having to work through with our partners, our delivery partners, on a site-by-site basis, how we can start to get those schemes off the ground. And to be honest, the discussions that we're having with government, particularly with MHCRG and Homes England, about how we can bring finance in to enable that delivery. We've got about 6,500 homes given planning permission, and we could be out there starting on site, but we actually need some financing to unlock that. Had COVID not happened, that we were having discussions within TfL about how we could do that, but this has become a lot more complicated since then. So that's the situation with our own commercial development programme. There are also implications from COVID for the housing infrastructure schemes that TfL has been successful in securing money from government on. So we were successful in securing money for the DLR and for the East London line. Both of these would unlock very significant numbers of new homes in places like Canada Water, and also up on the DLR north of the river. But both of these schemes are, well, one of them in particular, the DLR, is predicated on the base order of new DLR trains. So what the HIF fund gives us the ability to do is to get more DLR trains in addition to the replacement of the existing fleet. And so we need certainty on the money that we're going to have to do the DLR replacement before we can actually commit to the extra 14 trains for as part of that HIF programme. And so that's stuff that we're having to work through at the moment as well. The final thing I would say, actually two things. The growth fund that TfL has also in normal times helps to unlock third-party contributions that then benefit the transport network. So housing developments in town centres such as Walthamstow, there's a desire to redo the station there so that it can deal with a greater flow of people. In an ideal world, the TfL Growth Fund would be making a contribution to that to unlock a wider regeneration scheme. Until we get certainty from government about our level of funding going forward, there is a level of uncertainty about whether we can make a contribution to that. And then, of course, you've got the uncertainty that's associated with the big infrastructure projects, Crossrail 2, Bakerloo Line extension, which if you talk to local authorities along the routes of both of those schemes, there's a really big implication about the ability to bring forward high numbers of homes on sites along those routes, because it's really critical. If you're building those homes, people need to be able to get about in a sustainable way. And so actually COVID, I think, has had quite a big impact, and it is requiring quite a lot of thinking at the moment within TfL about how we manage all of that.
Thank you. And have you had a chance yet to assess the impact of potential reductions or changes in London's population and how that might affect your objectives?
Yeah, so that's a really tricky question to answer, I think. I think you're on a bit of a fool's errand if you try and predict with any certainty what is going to be happening with London's population. You may have read the reports, as I have done, about an outflow of EU nationals, perhaps people who had been working in the hospitality sector or in retail. And we all read news reports, don't we, of people who are saying, well, actually, I want to move out of London, perhaps out of a flat with no outside space to somewhere with a garden. And so, there is some evidence to suggest, well, there may be a plateauing or a decline in London's population. But then you look at other evidence. If you look at activity in the housing market in outer London, for example, it doesn't look like depopulation is going on. There seems to be quite a lot of activity still there. So I think it's too early to say what sort of market conditions there will be in terms of the sale of new homes in future. I do think, though, that even if London's population stays the same, I think there is an argument that we still need more homes. And I think the overcrowding that exists in some parts of London on social housing estates, in the private rented sector, we are as a city going to need to find ways to provide genuinely affordable homes in mixed communities, and public transport is part of that mix. And so, yeah, I think that even if the population doesn't grow overall, we've got to find a way to solve the affordable housing crisis, and I think TfL can play a part in that.
Yeah, and then about playing part in the recovery, what aspects of the Mayor's transport plan are you prioritising as part of that recovery work? And are you central to some of this recovery work as well?
Very much so. And I think all of the elements of the Mayor's transport strategy are really important in terms of the recovery. I wouldn't pick one over another. We've talked about the importance of enabling more people to walk and cycle more often, the importance of cleaning up our air. We've talked about how public transport and having a reliable system and a frequent service with high capacity is going to be really important in terms of building confidence. I think Crossrail, when it opens, will be a really pivotal moment in terms of London's recovery. I mean, some of you will have had the benefit, as I have done, of going down and seeing some of these stations, and they really are like small cities underground. And I think that when it opens, it's going to bring a real step change in terms of comfort and accessibility for people. So that's going to be, I think, a really important moment for the city as we go forward. I do think we are going to need to keep under review things such as our bus network and think about, well, how do we make the most of the resources that we've got? We've made some changes in the last few years to the central London bus routes so that we can invest in more routes and more capacity in outer London. I guess with the pandemic and more people perhaps working from home, perhaps doing more shopping in their local areas, do we need to continue that process? And so I think all elements of the Mayor's transport strategy are going to be really important to underpin the recovery.
And I think you've sort of answered my next question, which was going to ask you about how, because obviously TfL had an aim to distribute bus kilometres from central London to outer London, and you said you're looking at that. And our committee in 2017 produced to improve bus provision in outer London. So can you just give me a little bit more flavour about what work is going on around that, and when this committee can hear about particularly that bus provision in outer London?
Yeah, so over the course of the last year, actually, some of the work that we were already consulting on prior to the pandemic, we have moved forward with. So there have been some bus changes, for example, implemented in Richmond. One of the things we might look at initially is whether there can be relatively minor changes in frequency made to some of the central London routes. I've got to be honest and say that our ability overall, though, to increase the outer London network is going to be quite constrained. I think we're going to have to find a way of trying to maintain kilometerage in outer London and make sure that we've got the buses in the right places. One of the things that was part of the financial sustainability plan that we submitted to government did include a 4% reduction in bus services overall. And so we're going to have to look at how that balances out between inner, central and outer London. But I think at the moment, our thinking is that, our priority is around making sure that there are sustainable, attractive travel choices for people in outer London town centres, journeys between town centres in outer London. And I think we'll continue to look at the data, but that remains our strategy at the moment.
I'm very grateful that in the next week I'm having a new bus route, the 456 in through Enfield down into Harringay, which is really appreciated. But you see, it's going to be some time before we know how people's working and travel patterns may bed out, if you like. Does that mean that your plans for the bus network are going to have to wait for those potential changes to bed in, or are you able to make plans earlier?
So I think we will be looking over the next year to make some changes to the bus network. But you're right, it doesn't feel likely that within the next couple of months we're going to have the answers to how people are now living their lives in London. That's only going to emerge over a period of time. And so, I do think we have to consider the financial implications of that, how we diversify TfL's income streams. Again, part of what we put forward in the financial sustainability plan was about the need for London to be able to retain its share of vehicle excise duty. We pay £500 million every year into the Treasury coffers, and that money is spent on roads outside of London. And so actually being able to retain that money in London could make a real difference, given that, if fare income is lower because less people are travelling less often, then we're going to need to find a way to replace that lost income. VED would be our preference. I think it's the preference of the Assembly. But of course, you will be aware that the Mayor has also said if the government isn't forthcoming on that, TfL may have to look at other options, such as a Greater London boundary charge for non-residents, to plug that gap.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
So, thank you very much, Assemblymember McCartney. Now, Assemblymember Shah, you wanted to come in, but it will need to be brief. We're already running over time, so we do need to move on.
Sure, Chair. It's about outer London bus services. I've been following a conversation about this issue, both from the viewpoint of the Deputy Mayor and Assembly Member McCartney. What I'd like to say is that we had a very, very useful, very important root and branch sort of review of inner London bus service. And I have always, given where we are or where we were and where we are now even, doesn't it make sense that in the very near future, a similar review takes place whereby rather than, piecemeal approach, have a proper informed look at in terms of review of outer London route and branch bus services, bus network, so that we can plan better for the future for outer London, which is going through enormous development, enormous changes. So I just wanted to bring that into discussion and for future consideration, Chair.
I might just comment, if I may, Assembly Member. I mean, absolutely, it's good practice for any transport authority to periodically review the service that it provides, and in normal times. But certainly, as things become clearer, and we've modelled a range of scenarios, 5 scenarios actually, as to what might happen with London and therefore travel demand and the impact on transport. We've modelled 5 different scenarios, but at the end of the day, we don't have a crystal ball. It's our best guess at the moment. As and when things become more apparent, undoubtedly, we will have to adjust the service to accommodate working from home, changes in travel patterns, maybe more working in 15-minute town centres, and the outer areas, Harrow on the Hill, Wembley, Stratford, Croydon. So rest assured, that's something that our service planners will need to do. It's standard practice.
I think connectivity in terms of orbital route, connectivity in terms of different boroughs, etc., which is very, very poor currently, outer London areas. I think something which needs to be looked at rather seriously and urgently than one would have thought. Chair, I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Assemblymember Shah, you make a very important set of points, and certainly in terms of the integrated nature of the transport network and the coverage in outer London, it is something that I'm sure will form part of work over the next couple of years with the Deputy Mayor. I'd like to move on now to our final section, which is around scenario planning and TfL's ability to respond to longer-term transport challenges. And my first question is, and I'll take the first couple of questions here. To Heidi Alexandra, you've talked around this actually in several of the answers, but what needs to change in the MTS to be relevant to the emerging future challenges posed by COVID-19? And I'm asking you to add to what you've already said rather than rehash.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure there is much to add, to be honest. I think I've probably said it all in my answers to the previous questions, because I think that the MTS is the right framework through which to plan our transport services and how people move around. I think that whilst the pandemic has thrown up lots of questions that we need to answer, we have still got all the problems that we had pre-pandemic, which we're going to need to address. We haven't solved the housing crisis, we haven't solved the air quality crisis, we haven't solved, inequalities in health and well-being. And so I think all the things that went into forming the Mayor's transport strategy are still there. We may have to dial up and dial down. As I said, there may be more investment that we need in a sort of healthy streets offer in inner and outer London. Some of the brilliant work that's happened in central London may need to be replicated and grown around the city. I think there are questions about the nature of future transport investment and whether it is about increasing capacity on existing routes or opening up new bits of connectivity, so that when we're developing homes in parts of outer London, that those individuals that are moving to those new parts of London aren't dependent upon cars and can move around using the public transport network. And so I'm not sure there is much to add beyond that which I've said, to be honest.
I mean, the only thing I would add in that you consider, of course, is central, inner and outer London, obviously, and it isn't a one-size-fits-all, but actually also recognising that not all of outer London is the same either, and the 50-minute neighbourhood scenario fits perfectly with some areas. It's less applicable elsewhere. So it's just, I think, a more sophisticated approach is inevitably going to be part of your thinking going forward, I think. Andy, could I ask you a question of how the TfL's recovery scenarios impact on the delivery of the MTS? And you have touched on this already. Does the MTS need to change or adapt to deliver against those scenarios?
Not fundamentally, Chair, I wouldn't say. We are still fine-tuning our recovery work, both in terms of the customer campaign and working with businesses to get people to come back riding again, but also the analysis we're doing on the 5 scenarios we've identified and which are described within the FSP, the Financial Sustainability Plan. But I think the fundamentals of the MTS will remain as they are. You need to provide a quality transport authority or quality transport service. You want there to be healthy streets. You want safety. You want very much more to do on safety and Vision Zero, as the Deputy Mayor just said. Much more to do still on air quality. So the job's not finished. It'll probably require some tweaking as we understand better what the emerging travel patterns look like, and how much people go back to previous travel patterns. But the fundamentals, I think, will remain the same. It's a good document, and there's still more to do.
And if anything, COVID shone a sharper lens on some parts of that and some parts of that mission.
Yeah, it has, and without wishing to sound like a broken record, the biggest threat on the horizon is the money, without question. We can't carry on with these 6-month sort of hand-to-mouth deals. I get that the country faces dire straits. Don't get me wrong, I'm grateful for the financial support governments have given, but we must move on to a more secure financial footing. I've really implored government to see us as part of the solution, not a problem. That there's actual real benefit in investing in transport to get London motoring again, to get the London economy and thereby the UK economy going again. And I really want us to secure a long-term deal. That makes so much sense. No problem whatsoever with the quid pro quo being that governments say what they want as part of the sort of control period mechanism. Fine, hold me to account. Say at the end of this 4 years, then if we're giving you this kind of money, we'll expect to see the following. Sign me up. I'd be more than happy to strike that kind of deal.
And that financial support is needed so that you can be flexible in adapting to the post-COVID world.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. I'd now like to ask Assembly Member Devenish to take the next series of questions. He's going to ask one final one in this section and then take questions, the next couple of questions. So over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to start with Andy. I have to say, your last statement, Andy, I'd agreed with virtually everything that everybody said today, unusually, but when you said the greatest challenge is money, and you were talking about government subsidy, I have to say, I think the biggest challenge is the change in the society that we're going to see post the pandemic. And I think it's how TfL reflects the fact that, you know, frankly, most people I'm talking to don't believe people are going to go back to the office on Mondays or Fridays. They therefore don't believe a lot of people are going to be around shopping for half the week. And I think you need to face those challenges rather than just hope the government's going to bail you out, because I don't think they will. I think we'll probably agree on that, Heidi and I. You know, so the reality is you're going to have to be a bit more responsive. So could I just ask you, you clearly have to look at what you're doing in terms of all the things we talked about during this whole session, but would you agree with me there is a substantial danger, as you put it, that society, as I put it, society is going to fundamentally change, and therefore it's going to have to fundamental step change in how you deliver transport services in London?
Yes, and so for clarity, I entirely agree with you. The reason I mentioned finances is because finances, the financial challenge comes about, it's not the root cause, but it's the manifestation of those societal changes that you just described. So the fact that society probably will change as a result of this pandemic, that has a knock-on effect to money, which is why I focused on the money. But no, I do think anyone who thinks that the extreme end of our modelling will happen, because there were two. It's a bit like it's polar. There's 5 scenarios. At one end, you've got a highly unlikely one, which is that it's as though it never happened. Everyone comes pouring back to London. The Central and Northern lines are as packed as they ever were, and it's as though it never happened. I don't think that's likely. Equally, I don't think the opposite end of the spectrum is likely either, that that's it, London's done, it's a ghost town, it's doom and gloom, it's, you know, it's a hollowed out shell. I think it will be something in the middle, and that's where we're putting most of our efforts. And because of that, because I think there will be an element of people who now do work from home going forward. There will be some offices that don't reopen. There will be some businesses that maybe go to 3-day working weeks, whereby you work 2 days a week at home and 3 days a week in the office, or the other way around. And there will be more local need for enhanced transport in local areas rather than the centre. We have to react to that. And it obviously has a knock-on impact upon our finances. So in the FSP, I was at pains to make sure it wasn't an unsophisticated begging bowl. You can't just yell for more money. We've got to be more sophisticated than that. So we do show a way of getting self-sufficiency, including further savings, £730 million worth of savings over the next few years. So it's a combination of both.
Okay, thank you for that. And one final question on this section. In terms of the mail transport strategy, I've been very happy the way you particularly talked in your early days as Commissioner in terms of a word that hasn't been used, but only been used once in this whole meeting, and that is customer service. So perhaps because I think even people support the Mayor's transport strategy, which I'm not one of them, you won't be surprised to know, it is a vanilla document. You know, it's got lots of things that we can all agree on at very strategic level, but it's how you implement them. Customer services, so maybe you could say a few words about customer services. And can I just give you 2 examples where I'd love a commitment for you? One is you hopefully already know that a number of Assembly members, including the Chair, Assembly Member Prince and I, and others, have written to you about the lack of progress on tube noise. And all I just ask today, I'm not going to go into the subject today, all I'd ask is please confirm that you will respond to our letter of March the 3rd before Purdah. And secondly, and this will be very quick, is there anything you can say about trying to fast track the ferry for Hammersmith Bridge? Because that's got to be a #1 customer service for my part of London. Then I will desperately move on to my set question before the Chair tells me off.
Sure. March the 3rd, tube noise. I will immediately, we're off this call, follow up on that and make sure that you do get an answer to that before the pre-election period kicks in. Customer service is a passion of mine. I do not think you can claim to be a world-class transit authority until and unless customers feel valued. And the way that the best way of getting that actually is through a workforce that feels engaged and valued and cherished and committed, because then it's not sullen sort of, okay, I'll help you out because I've been told to. No, it's because you want to provide good customer service. So that's a passion of mine. And on Ferry for the Bridge, we are pushing this as fast as we can. Obviously, we've got to follow public procurement rules, but I'm all over it, as is Heidi. We know that there's a pressing need to get that ferry set up down there. There is a bit of a linkage to our negotiations with government, but we're not going to let that get in the way.
Thank you very much for that. And can I just say thank you for your road safety work, working with me and many others in terms of Battersea Bridge. It is hugely appreciated. I'm moving on to Will Norman. Hi, Will. Good afternoon to you. What lessons, please, have been? Again, a number has been covered, so don't feel you have to repeat the points again, Will. But the question is, what lessons have been learned from introducing temporary measures to deal with the challenges during COVID-19?
So I think we're still learning them, to be honest, Tony. I think one of the things I've certainly learned is that we can do things in a different way, and I think that's been evident across all of London, just on the pace, on how we can maybe do more with less, and I think that's going to be increasingly important as those challenges I touched on earlier that we will be facing, whether that's health inequalities, mental health, road danger, air quality, and economic return. There's going to be, whatever the scenario that we have coming out of this, the need for more active travel, whether that's in local town centres or coming into the centre or and out of London, is going to be there. So that need to do more with less, I think, is certainly the point. I think the point that we made earlier around not being able to do everything in temporary materials is very clear, that you can do some things, you can do some stuff and deliver it very well in temporary materials, and that's something I'd like to hang on to, but we can't do everything in that. So that idea of temporary plus, doing some stuff in temporary materials, some stuff in permanent is important. How we experiment with things and how we put things out, and being aware that everything that we've been doing, a lot of things have been tweaked and changed over this time, and continue to use that experimental piece. But I think one of the key things that we've learned over this period is that while the temporary materials were rolled out under government guidance that sort of essentially said that it was very urgent, we need to do it, it couldn't be done with the amount of consultation we would normally do. I think that reflecting on this, the importance for engagement, the importance of consulting, the importance of listening to people, it's just reinforced. The stuff that we've done in the past, this is not say, oh, these are referendums on whether we want this or not, but actually it's about improving the schemes. And often that local knowledge is so relevant, where a particular parking space is or what a particular need is for loading outside of business. That engagement is absolutely fundamental. The other piece that I think has been very clear is that when we do some of the temporary measures, so low traffic neighbourhoods are a good example of this. You can sort of put in planters, you can do some of the highway infrastructure, but actually that doesn't make the streets or the communities or the high streets accessible for everybody. So the need to be able to provide drop curbs or tactile paving or some of those other things that happen on the street that make sure that this is accessible for all Londoners. As Andy was saying about the transport network, that goes way beyond just the tube. That's the whole transport network. So for me, that's one of the takeaways from this. I think and we're continuing to learn in this area.
Thank you. To what extent will these temporary measures be made permanent? And are you able to give a date when we have all the schemes through with an answer on that question? Because I think one of the issues that you'll be aware that my part of London is particularly concerned about is how some of them have dragged on.
Yeah, all the emergency measures were that sort of under that government guidance, and as a consequence of that, they were all done under what is called a temporary traffic order, rather than what we would usually do as a permanent traffic order or an experimental traffic order. Now, under the temporary traffic orders can last up to 18 months. So every scheme that's gone on under a temporary measure, whether that's delivered by the boroughs or by TfL, has to be reviewed and engaged and consulted on and updated that traffic order within an 18-month period. So that's the hard date. But we've delivered, as I said earlier, hundreds of schemes across London, and suddenly waiting to the end of that 18-month period would be irresponsible and impossible to deliver because of the sheer volume of work that would have to be done. So this is being staggered. Now, some boroughs have already started doing this engagement and consulting work. I think personally going forward, some of these, I expect some of the measures to stay, and I think quite a lot of the measures might stay. Certainly some will need to be modified and changed and tweaked, and that's been part of the ongoing learning. So, for example, using more automatic number plate recognition, which allows the emergency services into areas, or we've moved wands around to allow sort of passing places for blue light services. So modification, and clearly some of them were appropriate for the emergency stuff and wouldn't necessarily last beyond that. So all the existing schemes will be engaged upon and consulted on and looked at whether they will be made permanently or not off the back of the monitoring work that's happening at the moment and that consultation work. Any new schemes that are happening now, as you know, are being consulted on and engaged. TfL, I think, have, well, I know they have because I've read it and I signed it off. They've issued new guidance to the boroughs on consultation and engagement, and there will be more of that coming. We're providing support for boroughs so that there is a consistent approach on how we move from temporary to permanent, or you remake those decisions, what monitoring data needs to be available to make some of those decisions moving forward. And we've also set a sort of a more qualitative engagement approach for certain groups. So we have our what was called a street space advisory group, which involves all sorts of different groups of relevant stakeholders as part of that, and obviously which has helped feed into that process.
And could I ask you again, as I've asked you on Twitter, to let me have a copy of the customer survey that you did for High Street Ken recently?
Yes, certainly. I'll provide the results as well.
I'd love to see it. Thank you very much. And Andy, I think Will may have given such a comprehensive answer. He's answered the question that the chair's asked me to ask, but I'll read it anyway. It is acknowledged that most temporary transport schemes are delivered and consulted on by London boroughs. However, for those that are the responsibility of TfL, are you planning to consult on the temporary measures? If so, how? How long do you consider it reasonable for a temporary measure to be in place before consultation is in place? And then finally, are there any schemes that have been introduced on a temporary basis that you believe would have been less likely to be introduced had a full consultation be required? But Will clearly has already answered most of that.
Sure, yeah, I mean, I think he did, and he did so very well. I mean, I am a big advocate of proper consultation, so I'm glad, I get why it was done in a sort of expedited manner when this first came about at the beginning of the pandemic. But I always believe it's better to have proper consultation, because that way you get communities buy-in to schemes. You never get everyone happy, but you get community buy-in to schemes, so that they're more likely to be successful.
Okay, for my final question, are you concerned about spending money on temporary measures that might prove unpopular and require removal once consultation has taken place? And I'd even say perhaps some of these measures have actually put back the rightful wish that we all have to do more cycling and walking in London.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, at the end of the day, I hate wasting money. But having said that, sometimes to do something on a temporary basis provides a trial, and you get to see if it works, if it doesn't. The downside of doing things going straight to permanent is sometimes you do that, it costs more to put it in, and it probably costs more to pull it out. So it's something we should always be careful about. The main thing for me is figuring out in advance, what are you trying to achieve, using data and and via proper consultation. What are the measures of success, and get it right first time. Has to be, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's true. I mean, if you steam into something without having properly thought it through, consulted it, or figured out what you're actually trying to achieve, you're more likely to fail. So let's do things properly.
I'll leave it there. Thanks very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember Devonish, and thank you to Andy and Will, and I hope we'll be able to get some information from you about that methodology data, and because actually I think it's really important to understand how that's being taken forward. So thank you very much for that. Could we now move on to a set of questions on which Assemblymember Pigeon will lead?
Lovely. We're on to finance now. I'm going to start with the Deputy Mayor and then I'll bring you in, Commissioner. Heidi, what steps are you taking to secure longer term funding beyond the current package that runs out this month?
Yes, I'd say our whole focus really is about securing that longer term, sustainable funding framework for TfL. It does feel like it's dominated my life really for the last 6 months. So you will know that we published the Financial Sustainability Plan in January, and that shows how we can get to a position in the next 2 years if we either have retention of vehicle excise duty or we introduce a Greater London boundary charge for non-residents, where you can sort of break even on the revenue account. That also assumes the savings that Andy was talking about earlier are delivered, but that beyond that, from 2023 onwards, it very clearly sets out the need for £1.6 billion worth of capital investment to ensure that we can continue to have a really high-class, world-class public transport system. So I won't go over what I've said about VED. I think we're all agreed on that would be the best solution. I've mentioned the fact that we're investigating the feasibility of the Greater London boundary charge for non-residents. We think that if that was levied at, say, £3.50 as a one-off payment and possibly £5.50 for the most polluting vehicles, given the number of vehicle movements over the Greater London boundary every day, you could be looking at raising about £500 million a year, which is a very significant amount of money. And that scheme could also have an important impact upon the number of car journeys being done. We think that it could reduce movements across the Greater London boundary by 10 to 15%, the vast majority of which would shift to still coming in but using more sustainable modes. So it could be a good thing for the train operating companies if more people are actually using the trains or our cross-border buses to come in. So that's a piece of work that is ongoing. We're also making the case, as Andy has said, for that capital investment over the longer term, and we're being very clear that really London can drive the UK's recovery and investment in our public transport system, given the extent to which we are reliant upon a supply chain in the regions, can really make a very, very significant contribution to our economic recovery.
Thank you for that. Be interested to know how the discussions are going with government and when you expect them to conclude. But also, you talked about that boundary charge. What I'd like to find out is where you are looking at smart road user charging, because it seems to me in the long term that's how you make your revenue side more sustainable, by having smart road pricing rather than all these little different schemes for congestion, for pollution, obviously when the technology allows, but having something smart for everything. How are you getting on with that work, and is that something you are considering as well?
So the Mayor's Transport Strategy talks about keeping options for road user charging under review. The specific piece of work about the Greater London boundary charge for non-residents, though, is something that TfL is doing a specific piece of feasibility work on. In terms of your question about how the discussions with government are going at the moment, it does feel a little bit like the calm before the storm. The funding deal that we did in October runs until the end of March. We're on the 8th of March now. We've got the TfL board meeting next week, and then of course the pre-election period starts in the week after. So I do think that the next couple of weeks are going to be a crunch time. It will be interesting to see whether government decide to give TfL a shorter term funding deal. I noticed in the budget they provided support for the train operating companies for the first 3 months, the first quarter of 2021-22. I think an arrangement like that, which might be an extension of the H2 funding deal, would cause very significant problems potentially for TfL, and Andy may wish to say something on that. But at the moment, I can't tell you that I think that it's going to be concluded by Friday of this week or Friday of next week. I think there's still a fair amount of water to go under the bridge with it all.
Okay, so the next 2 weeks critical in these negotiations. I'll bring Andy in a sec for his comment, but just to say, I realise the smart road pricing would be separate. I know it's in the strategy. Is there some work going on to look at that at the moment?
Not in detail, no.
Not in detail. Okay, thank you. Commissioner, do you want to comment? I'm sure I feel for you. You've had to keep going all these rounds with government. I don't envy that task, but how is it going? And perhaps you could also comment on the capital side and where you are in terms of how you're then going to prioritise capital investment and ensure there are no further delays to some of these major capital projects.
Sure. So, I mean, same as Heidi, it's dominated my time, and for that matter, that of my team. We literally, and I'll go straight up from this call, I'm going straight into a finance call. Literally, we probably have, I have, just as the Commissioner, my team are even more, I probably have 3 meetings a day on the budget. I have a weekly meeting with the Permanent Secretary to the DfT, where we are looking at how the discussions are going. It is arduous, it is grueling, it's somewhat exhausting actually, it's frustrating, but you know, we've got to stick at it. We need to get this deal. Heidi made reference to a short-term deal. I mean, you know, originally I wanted to get a 4-year deal for the beginning of 2021, so April, the beginning of the new financial year. Realistically, we're not going to get that. There is a comprehensive spending review in the autumn. So, you know, I'd still like to get a 12-month deal if possible, and DfT haven't ruled that out. But increasingly, I'm thinking it would probably be a shorter-term deal than that. And the problems that brings is we can't. It makes letting contracts way more difficult because the CFO has a fiduciary responsibility to he cannot let contracts worth more than we have for which we have funding. You know, you've got to make sure you've got funds in order to properly let contracts, and we let a bus contract every 2 weeks. So this is extremely concerning. It's very hard to run a £10 billion organisation when you don't know month by month what kind of money you've got to spend. So anyway, I'm sure we'll get a deal. I mean, government have said, Baroness Veer said on the floor of the House of Commons just the other day, or House of Lords, I guess it would be, that TfL will get funding, but we still don't know how much we're going to get, how long the deal will be, and what the conditions will be. So I know, you know, as much as you do right now, but it's very, very intense discussion that's happening. Capital, we have made the case for £1.6 billion a year up to 2030 because we want to contribute to those broader government objectives of things like greening the bus fleet, for example. The less we get, the more we have to rein back into my earlier answer about the job one, keeping it safe. So if in a pecking order, it's job one is keeping the existing system in safe state of good repair, and that means fleet, that means stations, it means platforms, track, drainage, ventilation, you know, the unsexy stuff. But you get your state of good repair, you must maintain that as job number one. I'd say the second priority is finish off what we're already working on. So I don't see any impact on Crossrail or Northern Line Extension or any of the other in-flight projects. Then and only then can you look at then you go to the ones that are committed but haven't yet started, things like the Piccadilly Line trains. And then and only then can you go to look at new items such as electrification of the bus fleet. So we're in the hands of those discussions. It's going to reach a crescendo. Really, we need to get a decision in order for us to present a balanced budget by the 16th of March. I guess you could say the next fallback would be the pre-election period because we can't talk about it after then. But the absolute drop dead must be decided by date is the 31st of March because that's when the money runs out.
Lovely, thank you for that. And I'm sure we will come back to this. It may well be after May when we know where we are, and it may well be, depending on the committee members then and so on, that we might want to write to government supporting, you know, some of these projects and so on, because it's so important, as you outlined earlier. Thank you very much indeed, and good luck with those negotiations.
Thank you very much for that, Assembly Member Pigeon. Now, Assembly Member Prince, you had indicated before the meeting that you might want to ask a question at this point.
To help you, Chair, I can let it go.
Okay, thank you very much. And so the final question is down to me, and in a sense, it's the almost the summary of what we've been talking about, and it's for Heidi Alexander. How do you see the MTS's role in planning for the future of London's post-pandemic network? You've said a lot about that, so if there's anything else you want to add, then that's absolutely fine. And in terms of the MTS itself, what are the plans in place? Are there any plans in place to refresh or revise the MTS in the near future, in any case, but particularly in that context?
Okay, so perhaps if I deal with the second question first. I mean, it's a refresh of the Mayor's Transport Strategy. It's not something that we have considered over the last year. As you will all appreciate, we've very much been focused on the immediate challenges of the pandemic and ensuring that securing the financial future of TfL. So it's not something that I have spent a lot of time giving consideration to. Having said that, any good organisation, any good administration keeps things under review, and if it may be the case, even if we don't refresh the Mayor's Transport Strategy, you might want to pull certain parts of it to the fore in terms of short-term delivery. So I think that's watch this space on that question, to be honest. I think in terms of the role of the MTS, I think you asked me about its role in planning the recovery. Is that right? In the future of the sort of transport network. I mean, for me, it's the foundation stone on which the recovery is going to be built. I think that it's so intrinsic, transport is so intrinsically linked to life in our city, whether it's the economy, the environment, air quality, carbon emissions, our health, when new homes are built, that, the analysis that is set out in the Mayor's Transport Strategy was right pre the pandemic, and it is right now. I think that after COVID, we may all become slightly more conscious of our own health, and I think the contribution that active travel and the Healthy Streets agenda can play to ensuring that we all lead healthier lives is going to be really important. And I think that relentless focus on ensuring that we have a high quality public transport system in place is going to be really important. None of us want to see a new era of gridlock on our streets in London. I think there is a danger if people take to their cars as opposed to returning to the tubes and the buses. And so I think that the building blocks of the MTS are going to be absolutely critical in terms of the recovery. And I think it's a very good document from which we can build and work upon.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I appreciate that, and I guess from my perspective as chair, it's about you having the resources to flexibly respond to whatever the post-pandemic period brings, but actually also that role that transport has, as you've just said, in driving and shaping London and as it evolves out of the pandemic. So, anything that you'd like to add to that, Andy?
No, I think Heidi summarised it really well. I think the main thing is to thank the Assembly members. We really appreciate your scrutiny in what we do, because ultimately, even though questions might be tough, we know that we're on the same team, I'd say, ultimately, because we all want London to succeed and we all want transport to succeed. The next next few weeks are seminal really to our future in terms of weeks and months. We must get this funding sorted out. You know, to Assemblymember Devonish's point, it isn't the funding just per se, it's getting the planning and sorted out as we figure out what London does look like post-pandemic. But having said that, you know, I like to finish on a positive note. There's lots of good stuff going on. We do have Northern Line extension that's going to open later this year. We're going hell for leather with the Elizabeth Line, making good progress on Barking Riverside. You know, there's lots of good stuff happening out there on the buses as well. So, you know, rest assured, we won't give up. We're going to keep at this, and we'll get the best possible deal.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. And thank you all three for your time in attending today and for your answers. It's been a difficult year in all sorts of different ways, and your time today and your answers are really valuable to us. So thank you very much for doing that. Can we, and you, the audience can't see, but there's a round of applause going on quietly for you all. But thank you very much, and thank you for your candour and your answers today. Can we note the report, the additional correspondence received, and the discussion today?
Noted.
Noted.
Can we also agree to delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the deputy chair and party group lead members to agree any output from today's meeting?
Agreed.
Thank you. Can we note the decision of the Executive Director of the Secretariat to appoint Waywill and Sudworth Limited to act as the external auditor for the statutory annual accounts of London Travel Watch for the 2021-22 to 2024-25 financial years, and note the committee's work programme for the remainder of 2020?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And finally, the London Assembly's annual meeting due to take place on the 14th of May 2021, which will decide which committees are to establish for the 2021-22 Assembly year, and a timetable of meetings for those committees will effectively relate to the date of the next meeting of this committee. Do we have any other business before we close?
Yes, Chair.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Can I just put on record for the committee our thanks to you as chair of the committee for the year. You've come in as a new Assembly member, and baptism of fire, you get to chair the Transport Committee. So you've done a fantastic job, and it's been really good working with you. So thank you for your work over the last year.
Well, thank you very much. And at the start of the meeting, I paid tribute to retiring colleagues, but I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank all the other members of the committee, and in particular you, Caroline, as Deputy Chair, for your support during the year and the benefit of all of your broad and deep knowledge about transport in London. Many thanks. And if I may now close the meeting.
Thank you,
Well
Chair.
done. Thank you all.
Thank you all for coming.